Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The lake had no business being that still. Even in the dead of winter, water should move, should breathe beneath its frozen skin. But Crater Lake sat like a corpse, its surface a perfect mirror of black ice that reflected nothing but the gray Montana sky pressing down like a coffin lid. I should have listened to the locals when they warned me about coming back. 3 weeks had passed since my younger brother Jake and I last visited this godforsaken place. That first trip had been uneventful enough. We'd drilled our holes, caught a few decent trout, packed up before the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Normal, safe. The kind of memory that should have stayed pleasant. But something had been gnawing at me since then, a persistent itch in the back of my mind that I couldn't scratch. Dreams of dark water and pale shapes moving beneath ice. Whispers in languages I didn't recognize echoing through my sleep. Jake had mentioned similar disturbances when I called him, his voice tight with exhaustion over the phone. We'd both agreed another trip might help shake whatever psychological residue clung to us from that place. Now, standing at the lake's edge with our gear scattered around us, I wondered if we'd made a terrible mistake. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since our last visit. My breath came in sharp white puffs that dissipated too quickly in the still air. The cold bit through my thermal layers like needles, and I found myself constantly flexing my fingers to keep circulation flowing. Jake moved with jerky, mechanical motions as he set up the portable shelter, his usual easy chatter replaced by tense silence. The ice auger felt heavier than it should have as I positioned it over our chosen spot. The motor coughed to life with a sound like grinding teeth, and I pressed down to begin drilling. The bit bit into the surface with satisfying resistance at first, sending up spirals of ice shavings that glittered like broken glass in the weak afternoon light. Then something changed. The auger lurched downward suddenly, as if the ice had simply vanished beneath it. I stumbled forward, nearly losing my balance as the motor whined with freed momentum. When I pulled the bit up, expecting to see the clean cylindrical hole we needed, my stomach clenched. The opening was wrong. Instead of the rough-edged circle the auger should have carved, the hole was perfectly smooth, its edges curved like they'd been melted rather than cut. Worse, the water visible through the opening wasn't the dark blue-black I expected. It was crystal clear, so transparent I could see straight down to the lake bottom 30 feet below. That's when I noticed the light. A soft, pulsing glow emanated from somewhere deep beneath the surface, casting an ethereal blue radiance up through the water. It wasn't constant. The illumination would brighten and fade in a slow, rhythmic pattern that reminded me uncomfortably of breathing, or a heartbeat. My hands began to shake, and not from the cold. Jake appeared at my shoulder, his face pale beneath his wool cap. He'd seen it too. I watched his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on that impossible blue glow filtering up through the hole. "We should leave," he said quietly, the first words either of us had spoken since arriving. I nodded but found myself unable to move. The light was hypnotic, drawing my gaze deeper into that crystalline water. Shapes seemed to move in the periphery of my vision, dark forms that might have been fish or debris or something else entirely. Every time I tried to focus on them directly, they'd slip away, leaving only that steady blue pulse and the growing certainty that we were being watched. The temperature around the hole felt different, warmer somehow, as if the ice itself was generating heat. Steam shouldn't have been rising from the opening, but it was. Thin wisps of vapor that twisted upward in patterns too complex to be random. They formed brief shapes that looked almost like faces, before dissolving into nothing. My heart hammered against my ribs as I forced myself to step back from the hole. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Bioluminescent algae, underwater springs, thermal vents. Anything that could account for what we were seeing without acknowledging the primal terror that was beginning to claw its way up my spine. Jake had already started gathering our equipment with sharp, aggressive movements. His breathing came in quick, shallow gasps that created thick clouds of vapor around his head. When he grabbed the auger from my nerveless fingers, I felt a brief moment of relief that we were leaving. Then the sphere appeared. It rose from the hole like a bubble breaking the surface, but solid, a perfect orb of the same pulsing blue light we'd seen below. About the size of a basketball, it hovered 3 feet above the opening, rotating slowly on some invisible axis. The surface rippled like liquid mercury, reflecting our horrified faces in warped, twisted versions that barely looked human. Every muscle in my body locked up. My throat closed as if an invisible hand had wrapped around my neck. The sphere's light wasn't just visible, it was tangible, pressing against my skin like warm fingers. I could feel it crawling over me, probing, searching for something I didn't understand. Jake made a strangled sound and stumbled backward, dropping the gear he'd been collecting. The metallic clatter seemed impossibly loud in the oppressive silence that had settled over the lake. The sphere pulsed brighter at the noise, and I swear I heard something like laughter echoing up from the depths below. We ran. There was no discussion, no plan. Pure animal terror launched us into motion, sending us stumbling away from the hole in that impossible floating light. Our boots slipped and skittered on the treacherous ice as we fled toward the distant shoreline where my truck waited. Jake's labored breathing mixed with mine, creating a ragged symphony of panic that seemed to chase us across the frozen surface. Behind us, the blue glow intensified, casting our frantic shadows far ahead of us like black stains on the white ice. The light was following us. I could feel it without looking back, could sense its alien attention focused on our fleeing forms with the intensity of a searchlight. That's when I heard the first crack. It started as a soft popping sound, like knuckles being flexed. Then came a longer, more ominous groan from somewhere beneath our feet. I risked a glance down as we ran and felt my blood turn to ice water. The surface beneath us wasn't solid anymore. Hairline fractures spider-webbed outward from each of our footsteps, spreading like infection through the frozen lake. But these weren't normal stress fractures. The cracks glowed with the same blue light as the sphere, as if our very presence was somehow poisoning the ice with that unnatural radiance. Worse, there were shapes moving beneath the surface, dark silhouettes that kept pace with us as we ran, their movements too fluid and coordinated to be fish. They seemed to be running alongside us under the ice, mimicking our desperate flight with mocking precision. Then, I saw the footprints. They appeared in the ice directly beneath our path, perfect impressions of human feet, complete with the treaded patterns of boot soles. But they weren't our prints. These were facing the wrong direction, as if someone was walking beneath the surface in the exact opposite direction of our escape. Each step we took forward was matched by a step backward from our underwater doubles. My legs felt like rubber, threatening to give out beneath me with each stride. Sweat poured down my face despite the bitter cold, and my heart hammered so hard I could feel my pulse in my temples. The logical part of my mind gibbered helplessly, trying to process what was happening and failing completely. Jake was gasping like a landed fish beside me, his face gray with exertion and terror. When he looked down and saw the same impossible footprints, he made a sound I'd never heard before, a broken whimper that spoke of sanity stretched to its breaking point. The shoreline seemed to recede as we ran, stretching away from us like a mirage. What should have been a 5-minute jog to safety became an endless nightmare of slipping feet and burning lungs. The blue glow behind us grew stronger, casting everything in an otherworldly radiance that made the world look like a photographic negative. More sounds echoed from beneath the ice now. Tapping, scratching, the rhythmic thud of fists pounding against the undersurface. Whatever was down there was trying to break through, and the ice was responding to its efforts with a symphony of groans and cracks that sounded disturbingly like screams. I could feel something watching us from the depths with an intelligence that was definitely not human. There was a patience to its observation, as if it had all the time in the world to study our terror. The sphere continued its lazy pursuit, maintaining the same distance behind us no matter how fast we moved. My truck finally came into view, looking blessedly normal and solid in the growing twilight. Jake reached it first, yanking open the passenger door with such force I thought he might tear it from its hinges. I dove behind the wheel, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine turned over on the third try, and I gunned it without bothering to warm up. Gravel sprayed from beneath the tires as we tore away from the lake, the headlights carving a tunnel through the gathering darkness. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of that blue glow still hovering over the ice, pulsing with steady rhythm. As I watched, more spheres began to rise from the water, dozens of them, creating a constellation of alien light that reflected off the frozen surface like fallen stars. We drove in silence for the first 20 miles, both of us staring straight ahead and trying to process what we'd experienced. When Jake finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and broken. "Did you see the faces?" he asked quietly. I had. In those final moments before we reached the truck, I'd glimpsed pale shapes pressing up against the underside of the ice. Human faces, or close enough to human to make my skin crawl. They'd been watching us with eyes that held too much intelligence, too much hunger. "We're not going back," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I could feel something tugging at the edges of my consciousness. A compulsion to return, to stand again at the edge of that impossible hole and stare down into the blue light below. Jake nodded, but I could see in his reflection in the window that he felt it too. The pull, the need to understand what we'd witnessed, even if that understanding came at a price we weren't prepared to pay. 3 days later, I found myself standing on my back porch at 3 a.m, staring north toward the mountains where Crater Lake waited beneath its shroud of ice. The blue glow was visible on the horizon, just a faint smudge of light that shouldn't have been visible from 50 miles away, but was. My phone rang. Jake's number appeared on the screen. "You see it too?" he asked without preamble. I did, and I knew, with the sick certainty of someone who'd already lost a battle they didn't know they were fighting, that we'd be going back. Maybe not tonight, maybe not this week, but eventually. The lake had marked us somehow, claimed us as its own. The blue light pulsed once, twice, like a slow heartbeat in the darkness, and I found myself already planning our return trip. Story 2. The neon sign of the Desert Rose Motel buzzed and flickered against the endless black of the Nevada highway, casting sickly pink shadows that danced across the cracked asphalt like dying insects. Every few seconds, the R in Rose would sputter out entirely, leaving only Deezy Toe's Motel glowing against the void, a name that felt more like a warning than an invitation. I pulled my rental car into the parking lot at midnight, my hands still trembling from the 8 hours of driving through increasingly desolate landscape. The coffee had stopped working 3 hours ago, but sleep felt impossible with the strange electrical humming that seemed to emanate from the very air around this place. The motel stretched before me in a horseshoe shape, 2 stories of peeling paint and rusted railings that groaned in the desert wind. The front desk clerk was a gaunt man with yellowed teeth who barely looked up from his crossword puzzle when I requested a room. His fingers, stained dark with what I hoped was ink, slid a brass key across the counter. "Room 9, he informed me in a voice like gravel scraping against concrete. When I asked about the Wi-Fi password, he just stared at me with rheumy eyes until I backed away from the counter, the key feeling unnaturally cold in my palm. Room 9 sat at the far end of the lower level, squeezed between what should have been Room 8 and Room 10. But the numbering was wrong. Room 8 was nowhere to be found, and Room 10 stood impossibly close to my door, so close that when I held my arms outstretched, I could touch both door frames simultaneously. The narrow space between the rooms was maybe 2 feet wide, creating a claustrophobic alley that seemed to swallow light. My room reeked of cigarette smoke and industrial disinfectant, a combination that made my stomach churn. The carpet was a brown shag that might have been any color originally, stained with decades of mysterious fluids. The bed sagged in the middle like a mouth, and the television was an ancient tube model that produced more static than picture. But it was the mirror above the dresser that first made my skin crawl, not because of anything supernatural, but because it was positioned to reflect the narrow space between the rooms when the door opened, creating an optical illusion that made the wall seem to extend infinitely into darkness. I tried to sleep, but the humming grew louder as the night progressed. It wasn't electrical after all. It sounded organic. like the drone of insects or the resonant breathing of something massive and hidden. Every time I started to drift off, a new sound would jolt me awake. Footsteps in the gravel outside, the scratch of fingernails against glass, the soft whisper of fabric brushing against walls. Around 3 in the morning, I heard voices coming through the thin wall that separated my room from the mysterious space next door. At first I assumed it was room 10, but the voices seemed to be coming from the narrow gap itself. 2 men were talking in low, urgent tones about mirrors and reflections and something they called the collection. Their words were muffled but persistent, seeping through the drywall like smoke. My throat felt like sandpaper as I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to understand what they were discussing. The conversation suddenly stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt hostile. Then came 3 deliberate knocks on the wall, directly where my ear was pressed. The sound was so loud and unexpected that I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. Sleep became impossible after that. I spent the remaining hours until dawn sitting in the single chair, watching the narrow space between the rooms through my window. The darkness there seemed thicker than natural shadow, almost textured, like black velvet hanging motionless in the still air. Twice I thought I saw movement, a flash of pale skin or the gleam of something metallic. But when I blinked, there was nothing. Morning brought no relief. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, but the space between the rooms remained shrouded in shadow, as if the light couldn't penetrate whatever existed there. I decided to investigate, telling myself it was simple curiosity, though my sweating palms and rapid pulse suggested otherwise. The narrow gap was even more claustrophobic up close. The walls pressed in from both sides, creating a corridor barely wide enough for my shoulders. About 10 feet in, where the passage should have ended at the back wall of the motel, I discovered something impossible. A door. It was painted the same institutional beige as the walls, almost perfectly camouflaged, with no handle or visible hinges. Just a thin rectangular outline that my fingertips could trace in the paint. When I pressed against it, the door swung inward silently, revealing a space that couldn't exist according to the motel's layout. The room beyond was circular, maybe 12 feet in diameter, with walls covered in dark red velvet that absorbed light like a hungry mouth. The air inside was thick and warm, carrying the metallic scent of old blood mixed with something floral and cloying. In the center of the room stood a man. He was tall and impossibly thin, wearing what appeared to be a burlap sack over his head, the fabric stained dark around where his mouth and eyes should be. The sack was tied at his neck with black velvet ribbon that matched the walls. His clothes were formal but ancient, a 3-piece suit that might have been fashionable a century ago, now faded to the color of dried bone. His hands, long and pale as candle wax, gestured for me to enter. My legs felt like water, but somehow I found myself stepping into the room. The door whispered shut behind me, though I hadn't heard the man move. When I turned to look, there was no door, just unbroken velvet wall stretching in a perfect circle around us. The man tilted his head, studying me through the stained burlap. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the velvet walls and into my bones. He told me he was a collector of sorts, gathering precious things that people left behind without knowing. He explained that I had something he needed, something I carried with me everywhere but never truly possessed. My reflection, he said, was tired of following me around. He gestured to a tall mirror that I somehow hadn't noticed before, standing against the far wall like a silent sentinel. The glass was perfectly black, not reflecting anything in the room, not even the dim light that seemed to come from nowhere. He invited me to look into it, to see what I had been carrying all these years. Against every rational thought screaming in my head, I approached the mirror. My reflection was there, but wrong. Older, sadder, with eyes that held knowledge I didn't possess. As I watched, my reflection smiled, though I wasn't smiling. It raised its hand in greeting, though my arms hung at my sides. The man explained that reflections were living things, trapped and forced to mimic their owner's every movement. He offered to free mine, to let it rest in his collection where it could exist independently. All I had to do was agree. and my reflection would finally know peace. The words left my mouth before I could stop them. I heard myself accepting his offer, though I couldn't remember making the decision. The moment I spoke, my reflection in the black mirror straightened its shoulders, nodded once in what looked like gratitude, and stepped sideways out of view. The room began to spin. I stumbled toward where the door had been, clawing at the velvet walls, but found only smooth fabric that seemed to pulse with warmth under my palms. My vision blurred, and the last thing I remembered was the man's satisfied nod before darkness swallowed everything. I woke up in my motel room, fully clothed on top of the bed, with afternoon sunlight streaming through the grimy windows. My head pounded, and my mouth tasted like copper and fear. For a moment, I convinced myself it had all been a vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion and too much coffee. Then I walked to the bathroom to splash water on my face. The mirror above the sink reflected everything in the room. The shower curtain, the toilet, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. Everything except me. I stood directly in front of the glass, waving my arms, leaning close enough to fog the surface with my breath, but cast no reflection at all. I ran to every reflective surface in the room, the television screen, the chrome fixtures, even the surface of water in a glass. Nothing. It was as if I had become invisible to mirrors, existing in the world but unable to see proof of my own presence. The front desk clerk watched me with knowing eyes as I checked out, his yellow smile stretching wider than before. He asked if I had enjoyed my stay, if I had found what I was looking for. When I tried to explain what had happened, he simply nodded and suggested I visit the optometrist in the next town over. Sometimes people had trouble seeing clearly after spending time at the Desert Rose. I drove away as fast as my rental car would carry me, but the absence followed. In store windows, car mirrors, puddles of water on the street, everywhere that should have shown my reflection showed only empty space. People began to stare, sensing something wrong even if they couldn't articulate what. Conversations would falter when I approached, and children would cry without reason when I came near. Days turned into weeks, and I learned to navigate a world where I cast no reflection. I avoided mirrors, covered the ones in my apartment, and learned to shave by feel alone. But late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, I could swear I heard my reflection's voice calling from somewhere far away, content and free, no longer forced to mimic my movements, living its own life in the velvet darkness of the collector's room. Sometimes I consider driving back to the Desert Rose Motel, back to that narrow space between rooms 9 and 10, to ask for my reflection back. But I remember the gratitude in its eyes as it stepped away from the black mirror, and I wonder if freeing it was the most merciful thing I've ever done. The neon sign still burns in my memory, flickering between Desert Rose and Days T.O.'s, and I understand now that both names are true. In the desert, things are lost and found in equal measure. I lost my reflection, but found something else, the knowledge that we are not as singular as we believe, that parts of ourselves might yearn for independence we never considered granting. The humming follows me still, a sound like satisfaction, like something precious finally at rest. And in the corner of my vision, I sometimes catch glimpses of movement in mirrors I'm careful not to look at directly. A figure that moves with my mannerisms, but chooses its own expressions, free at last to exist without constraint. The collector was right about one thing. My reflection was tired of following me around. Now it doesn't have to, and perhaps we're both better for it, even if I'll never know for certain what I look like again. Story 3. The security monitors cast their sickly blue glow across my face as I settled into another graveyard shift at the Meridian Hotel. 23 floors of corporate sterility stretched above me, but down here in the basement security office, surrounded by humming servers and the constant flicker of surveillance feeds, I might as well have been buried alive. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, and the fluorescent light above my desk buzzed with the persistent intensity of an angry wasp trapped in glass. I'd been working hotel security for 3 years, And the job had taught me that the real monsters weren't the occasional drunk guests or petty thieves. They were the slow, grinding hours that ate away at your sanity, one uneventful night at a time. The Meridian was a respectable establishment, the kind of place where business travelers paid premium rates for Egyptian cotton sheets and marble bathrooms. Nothing exciting ever happened here, which was exactly why the discovery on Monitor 7 made my blood run cold. The timestamp read 3:17 a.m. when I first noticed it. Camera 7 covered the 19th floor's east wing, a straightforward L-shaped corridor with 12 guest rooms and a fire exit. I'd stared at that same feed thousands of times over the years, memorizing every scuff mark on the burgundy carpet, every brass room number gleaming under the warm hallway lighting. But tonight, something was different. At the far end of the corridor, where the wall should have terminated in the standard beige paint and landscape artwork, there was another hallway branching off to the right. My stomach clenched as I leaned closer to the monitor, squinting at the grainy feed. The architectural blueprints were burned into my memory from countless fire safety reviews. There was no hallway there. The 19th floor ended with room 1912, period. I rubbed my eyes, blinking hard to clear the fatigue that must have been playing tricks on my vision. When I looked again, the corridor remained, a shadowy extension that seemed to stretch beyond the camera's limited field of view. The lighting in this impossible hallway was different too, dimmer, casting longer shadows that moved subtly despite the absence of any visible figures. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled up the building schematics on my computer, the familiar blue lines of the architectural plans confirming what I already knew. The 19th floor's east wing terminated at the emergency stairwell. There was no additional corridor, no extra space that could account for what I was seeing on the monitor. I cycled through the other camera feeds, searching for any sign of malfunction or interference. Every other floor appeared normal. Sterile hallways with their predictable patterns of doors and emergency lighting. Only camera 7 showed this anomaly, this architectural impossibility that made my skin crawl with an inexplicable sense of wrongness. The rational part of my mind insisted on simple explanations. Equipment failure, a glitch in the video feed. Maybe someone had been messing with the cameras during the day shift, and I was seeing some kind of delayed playback or digital artifact. But as I watched, something moved in that extra corridor, a subtle shift in the shadows that made my pulse quicken. I reached for my radio, then hesitated. What exactly would I report? That I was seeing things that couldn't exist? That the building had spontaneously grown an extra hallway? Jenkins, the head of security, already thought I was strange for volunteering to work nights. This would only confirm his suspicions that I was losing my grip. Instead, I decided to investigate personally. The 19th floor was only a few minutes away by elevator, and seeing the normal solid wall where the corridor appeared to be would restore my faith in reality. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, checking the battery levels on both devices. The radio crackled to life when I tested it, filled with the usual late-night static that plagued the hotel's communication system. The elevator ride to the 19th floor felt interminable, each floor passing with mechanical precision while my anxiety mounted. The numbers climbed steadily, 15, 16, 17, while my mind conjured increasingly irrational explanations for what I'd seen. By the time the doors slid open with their familiar ding, my shirt was damp with perspiration. The 19th floor corridor stretched before me exactly as it always had, with its burgundy carpet and brass fixtures gleaming under the recessed lighting. I walked slowly toward the east wing, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Everything appeared completely normal. The same numbered doors, the same generic landscape paintings, the same fire safety equipment mounted at regulation intervals. At the corridor's end, I found exactly what the blueprints indicated, a solid wall painted in the hotel's standard beige, adorned with a rather uninspiring print of a mountain lake. No mysterious hallway, no architectural impossibility, just a wall. I stood there for several minutes, pressing my palm against the cool paint, feeling the solid drywall beneath. The surface was unmarked, showing no signs of recent construction or alteration. My reflection stared back at me from the glass covering the artwork. A pale, slightly wild-eyed man in a rumpled security uniform, looking like he'd seen a ghost. But when I turned to head back to the elevator, something made me glance over my shoulder one final time. The wall remained solid and unchanged, yet something felt fundamentally wrong about the space. The shadows seemed deeper than they should have been, and the air carried a faint staleness that reminded me uncomfortably of old basements and forgotten storage rooms. Back in the security office, I immediately checked camera 7 again. The extra corridor was still there, as clear as ever. I could even make out more details now, what appeared to be doorways along the phantom hallway's walls, though the lighting was too dim to discern any room numbers. The discrepancy between what I'd seen upstairs and what the monitor displayed made my chest tight with anxiety. I spent the next hour documenting everything I could observe. The mysterious corridor appeared to be roughly the same length as the actual hallway, with similar carpet and wall treatment. The lighting fixtures were different, though, older somehow, with a yellowish cast that spoke of incandescent bulbs rather than the hotel's modern LED system. Most disturbing were the shadows, which moved with subtle but noticeable frequency, suggesting movement just beyond the camera's range. Around 4:30 a.m., I noticed something else that made my mouth go dry. One of the doorways in the phantom corridor was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness beyond. As I watched, transfixed by this impossible scene, the door moved, just a fraction, as if someone had bumped it from the inside. My radio suddenly crackled to life, startling me so badly that I nearly knocked over my cold coffee. But instead of the usual security chatter or maintenance updates, I heard something that made no sense whatsoever. A man's voice, clear and professional, began reading what sounded like a news broadcast. The words were crisp despite the radio static, and as I listened with growing unease, I realized he was reporting events from 1973. The broadcaster spoke about President Nixon, about the ongoing situation in Vietnam, about oil prices and political scandals that belonged to a different era entirely. His voice had the authoritative tone of network news, the kind of careful pronunciation that belonged to a time when television anchors were trained in dramatic speech. But this was impossible. My radio was tuned to the hotel's internal security frequency, and even if it somehow picked up an external signal, no one was broadcasting 50-year-old news at 4:30 in the morning. I grabbed the radio and checked the frequency display, confirming that it was set correctly. The news broadcast continued, completely oblivious to my presence, reporting on events that had happened decades before I was born. The announcer mentioned something about a hotel fire in Chicago, describing in clinical detail how investigators were still searching for the cause of the blaze that had claimed several floors of a downtown establishment. My hands shook as I tried to change the frequency, but the news broadcast followed me to every channel. No matter where I tuned the radio, the same voice continued his methodical recitation of 1973's tragedies and triumphs. The hotel fire story grew more detailed, more specific, until I realized with a chill that the building being described shared several characteristics with the Meridian. The number of floors, the general layout, even some of the architectural details. I looked back at camera 7, and my breathing became shallow and rapid. The phantom corridor was darker now, and I could swear I saw movement within its shadows, not the subtle shifting I'd noticed before, but deliberate, purposeful motion. Someone or something was walking through that impossible hallway, and as I watched, they seemed to be moving toward the camera. The radio broadcast shifted to a different story, but the announcer's voice never changed. He began describing strange phenomena reported at various hotels across the country, guest complaints about hallways that didn't match building plans, security cameras capturing impossible architecture, radio equipment receiving signals from decades past. Each report felt like a direct description of my current situation, as if the 1973 newscaster was somehow aware of what I was experiencing 50 years in the future. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to abandon my post, take the elevator to the ground floor, and walk away from the Meridian Hotel forever. But I couldn't move. My legs felt heavy and unresponsive, as if the office chair had become a prison. The radio continued its impossible broadcast, while camera 7 showed me things that shouldn't exist, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I began to wonder if I was losing my sanity. The figure in the phantom corridor was closer now, just barely visible in the dim lighting. I could make out a human silhouette moving with deliberate slowness, as if they were searching for something, or someone. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized they seemed to be heading directly toward where the camera was positioned, which meant they were moving toward the spot where I'd stood just hours earlier, touching the solid wall that couldn't possibly contain this endless hallway. I forced myself to stand, my legs wobbling with adrenaline and fear. If I returned to the 19th floor now, would I find the wall intact? Or would there be an actual corridor waiting for me? The thought of encountering that slowly moving figure in person made my stomach lurch. But the alternative, sitting here watching this impossible scene unfold, felt equally unbearable. The radio's 1973 broadcast had become more urgent now, with the announcer reporting breaking news about a security guard at a downtown hotel who had disappeared during his night shift. The man had been found 3 days later, standing in a corridor that building maintenance insisted didn't exist. He claimed to have been wandering the impossible hallway for months, though security footage showed he'd been gone for less than a week. When investigators tried to find this mysterious corridor, they discovered nothing but solid walls and empty air. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the elevator, my decision made by the growing certainty that staying in the security office would drive me completely insane. The radio continued its eerie broadcast, the announcer's voice following me as I left the basement and rose through the building's floors. By the time I reached the 19th floor, he was describing how investigators had theorized about temporal anomalies and architectural impossibilities that defied every known law of physics. The corridor looked exactly as I'd left it. Normal, predictable, completely mundane. But as I approached the wall at the far end, my flashlight began to flicker. The beam grew weaker with each step, despite the fresh batteries I'd installed just that morning. By the time I reached the spot where I'd pressed my palm against the solid paint, the light was barely a dim glow, and then, just as my fingertips touched the wall, the flashlight died completely. In the sudden darkness, I heard the radio more clearly than ever. The 1973 announcer was no longer reporting news. He was speaking directly to me, his voice emerging from the small speaker with impossible clarity. He told me about the hotel that existed in the spaces between buildings, the corridors that connected different decades, the guests who checked in during one era and wandered the halls until another. He explained how certain people, usually those who worked alone during the quiet hours, became sensitive to these overlapping architectures. As he spoke, I felt the wall beneath my fingers change. The smooth paint became rough, then soft, then seemed to dissolve entirely. Cool air moved against my face, carrying the scent of old carpet and forgotten rooms. In the complete darkness, I could no longer tell if I was touching a solid wall or standing at the threshold of that impossible corridor. The radio's voice grew fainter as I stood there, paralyzed by uncertainty. He was describing how the phantom corridors were doorways to other times, other versions of the same building that existed in parallel to our reality. Sometimes people stepped through by accident. Sometimes they chose to enter, driven by curiosity or desperation, or the simple human need to understand the inexplicable. I never decided to step forward. One moment I was standing in the familiar 19th floor corridor, and the next I was somewhere else entirely. The radio's voice faded to a whisper, then silence, as I found myself in a hallway that felt both familiar and completely alien. The carpet beneath my feet was the same burgundy as the meridians, but it was worn and faded in ways that spoke of decades of use. The walls were the same beige, but the paint was older, applied with techniques and materials from another era. Most unsettling were the room numbers. Instead of the brass digits I expected, these doors were marked with numbers that didn't correspond to any logical sequence. Room 1956, Room 1961, Room 1973. Each door marked with a year, rather than a standard hotel room number. I walked through this impossible space for what felt like hours, though my watch had stopped working the moment my flashlight died. The hallway seemed to stretch indefinitely in both directions, lined with dozens of doors marked with different years. Some were slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms that belonged to different decades, furniture and fixtures that told the story of changing tastes and technologies. The fear had transformed into something else by now, a kind of resigned fascination that kept me moving forward, despite the rational voice in my head screaming about impossibility and madness. I passed rooms from the 1960s with their bold wallpaper and space-age furniture, rooms from the 1980s with their pastel color schemes and geometric patterns, even rooms that seemed to belong to decades I hadn't yet lived through. Eventually, I found a door marked with the current year. When I opened it, I discovered a room that looked exactly like the standard accommodations at the modern Meridian Hotel. Crisp white linens, contemporary furniture, all the amenities I'd become familiar with during my security rounds. A digital clock on the nightstand showed the correct time, though I had no idea how long I'd been wandering the temporal corridor. The window looked out onto a view I recognized. The city skyline as seen from the 19th floor of the Meridian. Everything appeared normal, contemporary, reassuringly mundane. But when I tried to use the room's phone to call the front desk, I got nothing but silence. The radio I still carried remained equally silent, no longer broadcasting its impossible news from 1973. I spent what felt like days in that room, testing the boundaries of this strange reality. The door to the hallway remained accessible, but each time I ventured out, I found myself in a slightly different version of the same infinite corridor. Sometimes the years on the doors ran backward, sometimes forward. Sometimes I encountered other doors marked with future dates that filled me with both curiosity and dread. The psychological toll was immense. My sense of time became completely unreliable, and I began to question not just what I was experiencing, but my entire understanding of reality. Was I still sitting in the security office, having some kind of elaborate hallucination? Had I suffered a mental breakdown from years of solitary night shifts? Or was this actually happening? Had I somehow stepped outside the normal flow of time and space? The answer came when I finally decided to try returning to my own time. I found the door marked with the current year and walked through it with the desperate hope of finding myself back in the familiar world I understood. The transition was seamless. One moment I was in the impossible corridor, and the next I was standing in the security office basement, surrounded by humming servers and the blue glow of surveillance monitors. Camera 7 still showed the phantom corridor, but now I could see myself in the feed, a tiny figure standing in what should have been empty air at the end of the 19th floor hallway. I watched my own image on the monitor, seeing myself from the perspective of a security camera that shouldn't have been able to capture anything in that location. The radio crackled back to life, but now it carried only the normal security chatter and maintenance updates I was accustomed to. The 1973 newscast had vanished as completely as if it had never existed, but I knew it had been real. Just as real as the corridor I'd walked through. Just as real as the rooms full of different decades that I'd explored in that timeless space between buildings. I sat in my chair for the remainder of the shift, watching my own figure on camera 7 as I stood motionless in the phantom corridor. The image never moved, never changed, as if I'd become a permanent resident of that impossible space while somehow remaining present in the normal world. When the day shift arrived, I turned off the monitors and went home, but I knew I would return. The Meridian Hotel had revealed one of its secrets to me, and despite the fear and confusion it had caused, I found myself drawn back to that discovery. Night after night, I returned to my post, watching camera 7 and listening for the radio broadcasts from other times. Sometimes I saw other figures in the phantom corridor, previous security guards perhaps, or other hotel employees who had stumbled across the same impossible architecture. I never reported what I'd experienced. How could I? But I kept detailed notes, documenting every anomaly, every temporal broadcast, every glimpse of the hotel that existed in the spaces between reality. The Meridian continued to operate normally during the day, its guests completely unaware that their building contained corridors that connected different decades. And I continued to work the night shift, serving as an unofficial guardian of the hotel's most impossible secret. Sometimes, late at night when the building was quiet and the boundaries between different times grew thin, I would return to the 19th floor and step once again into the corridor that shouldn't exist. I learned to navigate its endless hallways, to read the stories told by its year-marked doors, to understand that some buildings are larger than their blueprints suggest. The fear never completely left me, but it evolved into something else. a kind of respectful awe for the mysteries that hide in plain sight, waiting for the right person at the right moment to discover them. The Meridian Hotel had chosen me to be its keeper of impossible things, and despite everything it had cost me in sleep and sanity, I found myself oddly honored by that responsibility. After all, someone had to watch over the corridors that didn't exist, to monitor the cameras that showed impossible architecture, to listen to the radio broadcasts from decades past. Someone had to ensure that the boundaries between different times remained stable, even if those boundaries were far more fluid than most people would ever realize. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the rest of the world slept peacefully in their normal, linear time, I stood guard over the spaces in between, the guardian of a hotel that was far larger and stranger than anyone imagined. Story 4. The first note slipped under my door at 3:17 a.m., its arrival marked only by the soft whisper of paper against hardwood. When I found it the next morning, the words, "Get out before midnight," glared at me in jagged handwriting that seemed to scratch at my eyes. My coffee grew cold as I stared at those 5 words, my fingers trembling slightly as I held the yellowed paper up to the pale morning light, filtering through the inn's grimy windows. The Wayward Station Inn had seemed charming enough when I'd booked it online 3 days ago. A converted railway station from the 1920s, nestled in the mountains of rural Pennsylvania, it promised authentic period accommodations and a step back in time. What the website hadn't mentioned was the perpetual chill that seemed to seep through the walls, or the way shadows lingered in corners long after the sun should have chased them away. I'd come here to write, to escape the suffocating noise of the city and finish the novel that had been strangling me for months. The isolation felt perfect, necessary even. Now, holding this cryptic warning in my shaking hands, that isolation felt like a trap closing around me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I examined the note more closely. The paper was old, almost brittle, with an odd yellow stain spreading from one corner like dried tears. The ink looked fresh, though. Too fresh. Someone had written this recently. Someone who knew I was here. Someone who wanted me gone. I told myself it was probably just the innkeeper's idea of a joke, some quirky local tradition meant to add atmosphere to the old railway station. But my rational mind couldn't explain away the ice-cold dread that had settled in my stomach like a stone. The inn felt different after that first note. Every creak of the old floorboards made me freeze, my breath catching in my throat. The antique radiators clanged and hissed with sounds that seemed almost like whispered warnings. Even the grandfather clock in the lobby, with its ponderous tick-tock, seemed to be counting down to something terrible. When Mrs. Hartwell, the elderly innkeeper, brought me breakfast, I mentioned the note casually, watching her weathered face for any sign of recognition. Her pale blue eyes flickered for just a moment before she insisted she knew nothing about it. But I caught the way her hands trembled as she set down the tray, how she avoided meeting my gaze directly. She knew something that made her afraid. The second note arrived that afternoon, sliding under my door while I sat just 10 feet away at the small writing desk. I heard the faint rustle and spun around, my chair scraping against the floor. My pulse spiked as I rushed to the door, yanking it open to find only an empty hallway stretching in both directions. The note lay face down on the threshold, and when I picked it up with shaking fingers, my blood turned to ice water. The salt protects them. Touch it, and see. My mouth went dry as I read those words over and over, the paper crinkling under my grip. Salt? What salt? I glanced around my room, searching for anything that might fit the cryptic message. The space was sparse, just a narrow bed with a faded quilt, the writing desk, a wardrobe that smelled of mothballs, and a wash basin with a cracked mirror above it. But as my eyes swept the room, something made me drop to my hands and knees beside the bed. A compulsion I couldn't name drove me to peer into the shadows beneath the old metal frame. There, scattered across the dusty floorboards like broken glass, were dozens of small, white crystals. Salt. My breathing became shallow and rapid as I reached toward the nearest cluster. The crystals were coarse and uneven, nothing like table salt, They looked hand-carved almost, with sharp edges that caught what little light filtered under the bed. Some were no bigger than rice grains, others the size of my thumbnail. The moment my fingertip made contact with the largest crystal, the world exploded into chaos. The room vanished. The inn vanished. Everything I knew as real simply ceased to exist. I was standing in a train car, but not standing exactly. I was suspended, frozen, like a fly trapped in amber. Around me, other figures moved in the same impossible stillness. Men in wool coats and fedoras, women in fur-trimmed jackets and cloche hats, all carrying leather suitcases and traveling bags. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were completely black. They moved through the train car in a grotesque procession, dragging their luggage behind them with mechanical precision. The sound of the suitcases scraping against the floor was deafening in the absolute silence, a rhythmic grinding that seemed to burrow into my skull. One passenger, a young woman in a beaded dress, passed so close I could see the frost forming on her eyelashes. Her mouth was open in what might have been a scream, but no sound emerged. I tried to move, to breathe, to blink, but my body was locked in place. Only my mind remained active, racing with terror as I watched the frozen parade of passengers. They were beautiful and horrible at the same time, like porcelain dolls come to life, but wrong, fundamentally wrong. The vision lasted only seconds before I yanked my hand back from the crystal, gasping as reality slammed back into place. I was on the floor of my room, my shirt soaked with cold sweat, my heart beating so fast I thought it might explode. The silence that followed was almost worse than the vision itself, a heavy, expectant quiet that pressed down on me like a physical weight. I scrambled away from the bed, my back against the wall, staring at the innocent-looking crystals with wide, terrified eyes. What the hell had just happened? Was I losing my mind? The rational part of my brain offered explanations. Stress, lack of sleep, too much caffeine. But my body knew better. Every cell screamed that what I'd seen was real, impossibly real. The third note came at sunset, just as the last weak rays of light were fading from my window. This time I was watching the door, and I saw the paper appear as if materialized from thin air. One moment nothing, the next moment the crisp white rectangle sliding across the threshold. I didn't want to read it. My hands shook so violently I could barely pick it up. The message was longer this time, written in the same scratchy handwriting. They were passengers on the last train, December 23rd, 1926. The blizzard stopped them here. They've been waiting ever since. The salt keeps them bound, but each touch weakens the barrier. Leave now or join them. December 23rd, 1926. I'd read about that storm in the inn's guest book, the worst blizzard in Pennsylvania history. The final train to stop at Wayward Station before the line was permanently closed. The temperature had dropped to 40 below zero. Search and rescue teams couldn't reach the stranded passengers for 3 days. By then, it was too late. My research instincts kicked in despite my terror. I crept downstairs to the lobby, which had been converted from the original station waiting room. The walls were lined with old photographs and newspaper clippings, tourist attractions now. But my eyes found what I was looking for immediately. A yellowed newspaper headline screamed, 23 passengers found frozen at Wayward Station. The accompanying photograph showed a line of sheet-covered bodies being carried from the train. 23 people who had died waiting for rescue that came too late. 23 souls who might never have left this place. I counted the salt crystals under my bed when I returned to my room. 23. Night fell like a curtain dropping, and with it came sounds I hadn't noticed before. Footsteps in the hallway above my room, slow and deliberate. The distant scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Occasionally, I heard what sounded like suitcase wheels rolling over hardwood, growing closer, then fading away. Mrs. Hartwell had retired hours ago, and I was supposedly the only guest. So who was making those sounds? I tried to convince myself it was just the old building settling, pipes expanding and contracting with temperature changes. But deep down, I knew better. The passengers were restless tonight, and somehow touching those salt crystals had made them aware of me. The fourth note appeared at 11:47 p.m., just 13 minutes before the midnight deadline. I found it not under my door this time, but on my pillow, though I'd been sitting on the bed just moments before. The paper was ice cold to the touch, and when I unfolded it, my blood turned to slush. One touch left. I understood now with horrible clarity. Each time I'd touched the salt crystals, I'd weakened whatever barrier kept the frozen passengers trapped in their liminal state. 3 touches. The first had shown me their existence. The second had made them aware of mine. A third touch. A third touch would complete something I didn't want to understand. The scraping sounds in the hallway grew louder, more insistent. I could hear them clearly now. The unmistakable sound of heavy suitcases being dragged across wooden floors, metal latches clicking open and shut, the whisper of old leather against wood. They were gathering. My watch showed 11:52. 8 minutes until midnight. 8 minutes to decide whether to flee into the freezing mountain night or face whatever was coming for me. But as I reached for my jacket, my eyes fell on the salt crystals again. Despite my terror, a sick curiosity gnawed at me. What would happen if I touched them one more time? What was the final secret they were trying to show me? My hand moved toward the largest crystal almost against my will. This was insane. This was suicide. But the need to know, to understand what had really happened here, was stronger than my fear. The moment my skin made contact, I was back in the train car, but this time was different. This time I wasn't frozen. This time I could move. The passengers turned to look at me with their black, endless eyes. The young woman in the beaded dress stepped forward, her mouth forming words that emerged as crystalline whispers in the frigid air. She was trying to tell me something important, but I couldn't quite make out the words over the sound of wind howling through broken windows. Then I understood. They weren't malevolent. They weren't trying to trap me or add me to their number. They were trying to warn me. Because I wasn't the first person to stay in this room. I wasn't the first to find the salt crystals. And I wasn't the first to receive the notes. The notes weren't from the passengers. They were from previous guests. People like me who had discovered the truth too late. People who had made that final, fatal touch and found themselves forever bound to this place, existing in the spaces between moments, trying desperately to warn the next victim. As this realization crashed over me, I felt the train car beginning to fade. But instead of returning to my room, I found myself standing in the inn's lobby. The grandfather clock read 11:59. Mrs. Hartwell stood at the front desk, no longer the kindly old innkeeper, but something else entirely. Her skin had taken on that same translucent quality as the passengers, and when she smiled, I saw that her teeth were made of salt. "Welcome to the permanent collection," she whispered, her voice like wind through winter trees. "We've been waiting for you to complete the Trinity." The Trinity. 3 touches. 3 links in a chain that bound the living to the dead. I had 1 minute to escape. 1 minute before midnight sealed my fate forever. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled toward the door, but with each step, the inn seemed to stretch longer. The exit moving farther away, the temperature plummeted with each second that passed, my breath becoming visible in sharp puffs. 50 seconds. 40. 30. I could hear them all now. Not just the 23 passengers, but every guest who had stayed in this room over the decades. Dozens of voices calling out warnings that came too late, pleading with me to run, to escape the trap they had fallen into. With 10 seconds left, I threw myself at the front door, my shoulder slamming into the old wood with enough force to send pain shooting down my arm. The door held fast, sealed by more than mere locks. 5 seconds. 4. 3. I pressed my back against the door and closed my eyes, waiting for the midnight chime that would make me part of the inn's permanent collection. 2. 1. Silence. When I opened my eyes, I was standing outside in the freezing mountain air, my breath forming clouds in the starlight. My car keys were clutched in my hand, though I didn't remember grabbing them. In my other hand was a piece of paper, another note, but this one was in my own handwriting. For the next guest, get out before midnight. The salt protects them. Touch it and see. They were passengers on the last train. I was already writing the warnings, already becoming part of the cycle. But I was still alive, still free, still able to leave this cursed place behind. I drove through the night, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Wayward Station Inn. But even now, weeks later, safe in my own apartment, I can still feel the cold touch of those salt crystals on my fingertips. I can still hear the scrape of suitcases in quiet moments. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I find myself writing notes in my sleep, warnings for the next victim, the next curious soul who will ignore every red flag and make that final, irreversible touch. Because the Trinity isn't complete yet. Someone else will stay in that room. Someone else will find the crystals. And when they do, I'll be there, trapped in the spaces between moments, trying desperately to save them from the same fate that almost claimed me. The cycle continues. It always continues. The inn is still taking reservations. Story 5. The first thing I notice isn't the unfamiliar wooden walls or the musty smell of decay that clings to everything like a second skin. It's the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a forest retreat, but the oppressive, suffocating silence that presses against my eardrums until they ache. My eyes snap open to complete darkness, and for a moment, I wonder if I'm still dreaming. But the rough wooden floor beneath my back, the splinters that dig into my palms as I push myself up, and the bitter taste of copper in my mouth tell me otherwise. I'm in a cabin. How I got here remains a complete mystery, locked away in some inaccessible corner of my mind. The last thing I remember is driving home from work, the familiar stretch of highway that I'd traveled thousands of times before. Everything after that is a black void, as if someone had taken an eraser to my memory. My head throbs with each heartbeat, a steady percussion that echoes in the hollow space around me. I reach for my phone, but my pocket is empty. Panic begins to crawl up my throat like a living thing. I need light. I need to see where I am, to understand what's happened to me. Fumbling in the darkness, my hands sweep across the floor until they encounter something cold and metallic. A lantern. My fingers trace its familiar shape, finding the small knob that controls the wick. There are matches beside it, scattered across what feels like a rough wooden table. With trembling hands, I strike one, and the small flame dances to life, casting wild shadows across the cabin's interior. The space is small and sparse, a single room with log walls that seem to absorb the light rather than reflect it. There's a narrow cot in one corner, a table, a chair, and little else. No windows that I can see, just a heavy wooden door that looks like it hasn't been opened in years. The air tastes stale and metallic, as if it's been trapped here for decades. I light the lantern's wick, and warm yellow light spreads across the room. That's when I see it. My shadow stretches across the far wall, as expected, but there's another one beside it, a second shadow that mirrors my exact position, my exact posture. I raise my hand, and both shadows raise their hands. But the second one moves a fraction of a second later, like an echo made of darkness. My heart hammers against my ribs. I tell myself it's a trick of the light, perhaps a reflection from some surface I haven't noticed. But as I move around the room, both shadows follow me with that same unsettling delay. When I stop abruptly, my real shadow stops immediately, but the second one continues for a moment longer before settling into position. The sensation of being watched crawls across my skin like insects. I spin around, but the cabin is empty except for me and the dancing light of the lantern. Yet the feeling persists, growing stronger with each passing moment. It's as if someone is standing just behind me, breathing on my neck. But when I turn, there's nothing there except empty air and my own mounting terror. I examine the door, hoping for escape, but it's locked from the outside. There's no keyhole on this side, no handle, just smooth wood that might as well be a solid wall. I pound on it until my fists are raw, but the sound seems to die just inches from the door, swallowed by the oppressive silence that fills this place. Returning to the center of the room, I hold the lantern higher, studying the second shadow more carefully. It's definitely there, definitely real, moving with my every gesture, but always that fraction of a second behind. The delay is consistent, exactly 3 seconds, as if some invisible force is replaying my movements with perfect precision. I try an experiment. I wave my hand in a complex pattern, then watch as both shadows repeat the motion. My real shadow follows immediately, but the second one performs the exact same gesture 3 seconds later, down to the smallest detail. The accuracy is impossible, unnatural. My breathing becomes shallow and rapid. The rational part of my mind searches for explanations. Perhaps I'm hallucinating. Maybe whatever brought me here also affected my perception. Head injuries can cause visual disturbances, false perceptions. But the shadow is too consistent, too precise to be a hallucination. As I continue to move around the room, I notice other disturbing details. The wooden floorboards are stained in several places with dark patches that could be old blood. Scratch marks score the walls near the door, as if previous occupants had clawed at the wood in desperation. The cot's thin mattress is yellowed with age and stained with substances I don't want to identify. Hours pass, or what feels like hours. Without windows or natural light, time becomes meaningless. The lantern's flame flickers occasionally, and each time it does, both shadows dance in unison, the second one always trailing behind like a macabre echo. I try extinguishing the lantern entirely, thinking that perhaps in complete darkness, whatever is creating the second shadow will cease to exist. But in the absolute blackness that follows, I hear something that makes my blood freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps that seem to circle the cabin's interior. But they're not my footsteps. I'm sitting perfectly still on the floor, not moving a muscle. The footsteps continue for exactly 3 seconds after I lit the lantern again, then stop abruptly. My shadow appears on the wall, alone this time. But within moments, the second shadow materializes beside it, perfectly positioned as if it had been there all along. I begin to pace frantically, my mind racing to find some logical explanation. The second shadow follows faithfully, always 3 seconds behind. But now I notice something new. The delay isn't random. It's exactly the amount of time it would take for light to travel to some distant point and back, as if my shadow is being projected to somewhere else, recorded, and then transmitted back to this room. But that's impossible. The physics don't make sense. Light doesn't work that way, especially not in a simple log cabin with a single oil lantern. I examine every inch of the walls, searching for hidden cameras or mirrors or any device that might explain what I'm experiencing. But there's nothing. Just rough logs sealed with mud and moss, completely solid and opaque. The paranoia grows stronger. I'm being watched, studied, documented. Every movement I make is being recorded by something or someone with capabilities I can't understand. The second shadow isn't just following me. It's copying me with a precision that suggests intimate knowledge of my every gesture. I try to trick it. I begin a motion with my left hand, then suddenly switch to my right. But the second shadow completes both movements in sequence. First, the false start with the left hand, then the switch to the right, all exactly 3 seconds behind my actual movements. It's seeing everything I do, even my aborted gestures. My mouth goes dry, and sweat begins to pour down my face despite the cabin's cool temperature. Whatever is creating this phenomenon knows me better than I know myself. It's predicting my movements, anticipating my reactions. I decide to test its limits. I begin moving in increasingly erratic patterns, jumping, spinning, making random gestures with my arms and legs. The second shadow follows everything perfectly, maintaining that precise 3-second delay. But as I continue this frantic dance, I notice something that makes my stomach drop. The second shadow is beginning to anticipate my movements. Occasionally, it starts a gesture a fraction of a second before I complete it, as if it knows what I'm going to do before I do it. This realization sends me into a panic. I rush to the door again, throwing my full weight against it, screaming for help, for someone to let me out. But my voice seems to die just inches from my mouth, absorbed by the strange atmosphere of this place. When I return to the center of the room, gasping and exhausted, I see something that nearly stops my heart. The second shadow is moving independently. While my shadow stands still, reflecting my current position, the second shadow is walking slowly across the wall, moving with purpose toward something I can't see. I watch in frozen terror as the shadow reaches the far corner of the room and appears to bend down, as if picking something up. Then it returns to its position beside my real shadow and resumes its normal behavior, copying my movements with that 3-second delay. But now I understand. The second shadow isn't just copying me. It's showing me what I'm going to do. It moved to that corner because in 3 seconds, I'm going to walk to that corner myself. And even as this thought forms in my mind, I feel my legs begin to move. Not by my own choice, but as if compelled by some invisible force. I walk to the exact spot where the shadow had gone, and my hand reaches down automatically to the floor. My fingers close around something small and hard. A key. The key to the door. I examine it in the lantern light, my hands shaking so violently I can barely hold it steady. It's old and tarnished, but it fits the lock I can feel on the outside of the door. But how did I know it was there? How did the shadow know? As I approach the door, key in hand, I realize the horrible truth. The second shadow isn't an echo of my movements. It's a preview. It's showing me my future, 3 seconds before it happens. And if it can show me the future, then it can control the future. Or perhaps I'm controlling it. Perhaps the shadow is my own consciousness, displaced in time, trying to communicate with my present self. Maybe I've been in this cabin before, many times, reliving the same sequence of events over and over again. I insert the key into the lock and it turns easily. The door swings open to reveal not the outside world I expected, but another room identical to the one I'm leaving. Another cabin with the same sparse furnishings, the same stained floorboards, the same oppressive atmosphere. But this room has no lantern. I step inside, carrying my light source, and immediately 2 shadows appear on the wall. Mine, and the second one, still trailing 3 seconds behind. The door closes behind me with a soft click, and I hear the lock engage automatically. I'm trapped again, but in a different room, or perhaps the same room. The layout is identical, but something feels different. The stains on the floor are in slightly different positions. The scratch marks on the walls follow different patterns. I search this new room and find another key, exactly where the shadow shows me it will be. This key opens another door to another identical room, and another, and another. Each room is the same yet different, as if I'm moving through infinite variations of the same space, and in each room, the second shadow becomes more independent, more active. Sometimes it moves for minutes at a time while my real shadow remains stationary. It explores corners I haven't examined, points to objects I haven't seen, performs actions I haven't taken. But always, eventually, I find myself compelled to follow its lead. My body moves without my conscious control, retracing the shadow's movements exactly. I'm becoming a puppet to my own displaced consciousness, following a script written by some version of myself that exists 3 seconds in the future. The rooms begin to change subtly. The walls grow darker, the air thicker. Strange symbols appear carved into the wood, symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly. The second shadow begins to interact with these symbols, touching them in specific sequences while I stand helplessly watching. And then I'm compelled to repeat the exact same movements, my fingers tracing the painful symbols in the precise order the shadow had demonstrated. With each symbol I touch, the cabin changes. The walls breathe. The floor shifts beneath my feet. Reality becomes fluid, malleable, responding to the mysterious patterns carved into the wood. I understand now that I'm not trapped in a physical space. I'm trapped in a temporal loop, a closed circuit of cause and effect where my future self is controlling my present actions through the medium of that impossible shadow. But why? What is the purpose of this endless repetition? What am I supposed to learn or accomplish in this place outside of normal time and space? The answer comes when I reach a room that's different from all the others. This one has windows, and through them I can see not the outside world, but other versions of myself in other rooms, all carrying lanterns, all followed by their own second shadows. There are dozens of them, hundreds, all moving through their own sequences of rooms, all following the guidance of their displaced shadows, all trapped in their own temporal loops. I realize that I'm not alone in this experience. Whatever force created this place has captured many others, all of us existing in parallel timelines that occasionally intersect and overlap. But as I watch the other versions of myself, I notice something crucial. Some of them are moving differently. Their shadows aren't leading them anymore. Instead, they're leading their shadows, making independent choices, breaking free from the predetermined patterns. The key to escape isn't in following the shadow's guidance, but in rejecting it, in choosing to act contrary to what it shows me, even when every instinct and compulsion tells me to obey. With tremendous effort, I force myself to move in the opposite direction from where my shadow is pointing. The resistance is enormous, like swimming against a powerful current, but gradually I feel the control loosening. My shadow begins to flicker and fade. The second shadow struggles to maintain its form, becoming translucent and unstable. I continue to defy its guidance, making random, unpredictable movements that it cannot anticipate or copy. And slowly, painfully, the second shadow dissolves entirely, leaving only my real shadow dancing alone on the wall. The room around me begins to fade as well, the walls becoming transparent, the floor insubstantial. I'm falling through layers of reality, passing through the infinite rooms I've inhabited, seeing them all simultaneously from a perspective outside of time. I land hard on cold asphalt, gasping and disoriented. I'm in a parking lot outside a roadside diner, lying beside my car with my keys still in my hand. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the pavement, but they're normal shadows, single shadows that move exactly as they should. People are gathering around me, asking if I'm all right, if I need medical attention. I tell them I'm fine, that I must have fainted, but I can't explain the hours or days that seem to have passed while I was trapped in that place. As I drive home, I notice something in my rearview mirror that makes my blood run cold. My reflection is normal, but the car's shadow on the road behind me moves just slightly out of sync, trailing by exactly 3 seconds. The shadow world hasn't released me entirely. It's still there, waiting, watching, ready to pull me back if I let my guard down. I'll have to remain vigilant, always checking my shadows, always ensuring they move when and how they should. Because now I know the truth about that place outside of time. It's not just a prison, it's a testing ground, and some of us pass the test while others remain trapped forever, following the guidance of their displaced shadows through infinite variations of the same terrible room. I passed the test this time, but I have a feeling it's not over. The second shadow is still there, lurking just beyond the edge of perception, waiting for another chance to show me the future I'm supposed to follow. And I'm terrified that someday I might not be strong enough to resist its guidance. Story 6. The GPS had been lying to me for the last 20 minutes, its cheerful voice directing me down roads that seemed to exist only in its digital imagination. The screen showed I was driving through empty fields, but the cracked asphalt beneath my tires and the skeletal fence posts sliding past my headlights told a different story. Something was fundamentally wrong with this place, though I couldn't yet articulate what twisted my stomach into knots as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I'd been delivering pizzas for 3 years, and I thought I'd seen every corner of this godforsaken county. But this address, 717 Harvest Moon Lane, had never appeared on any delivery before tonight. The order had come in just before closing, a simple request for 2 large pepperonis with extra cheese, paid for online with a hefty tip that made my manager's eyes light up with dollar signs. He'd practically shoved me out the door with the warming bags, reminding me that good customers like this kept the lights on. Now, as my headlights carved through the oppressive darkness ahead, I wondered if any amount of money was worth this growing sense of dread that crept up my spine like ice-cold fingers. The road narrowed further, and my car's engine seemed to strain against some invisible resistance. The familiar hum became a labored wheeze, and I found myself pressing harder on the accelerator just to maintain the same sluggish pace. Through the windshield, the world ahead remained stubbornly black, as if my headlights were being absorbed by the darkness rather than piercing it. Even the dashboard lights seemed dimmer, casting everything in an amber glow that made the interior feel more like a tomb than a vehicle. My phone had lost signal 15 minutes ago, the bars disappearing one by one until only the emergency-only indicator remained. The radio had dissolved into static, then silence, leaving me alone with the sound of my own increasingly rapid breathing and the uncomfortable sensation that something was watching me from the void beyond my windows. When the farmhouse finally materialized from the gloom, my first instinct was relief. The structure looked normal enough, a two-story colonial with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that had seen better decades. A single light glowed in an upstairs window, warm and welcoming against the hostile night. But as I pulled into the gravel driveway, that relief curdled into something else entirely. The sound my tires made on the gravel was wrong. Instead of the familiar crunch, each rotation produced a wet, squelching noise, as if I were driving through mud rather than stone. When I turned off the engine and stepped out, my shoes sank slightly into what should have been solid ground. The smell hit me immediately. Rich, earthy, organic, but with an undertone of decay that made my nostrils burn and my eyes water. I grabbed the warming bags from the passenger seat, their familiar weight somehow comforting in this alien landscape. The pizza boxes radiated heat against my chest as I approached the front porch, my footsteps creating that same disturbing squelch with each step. The porch boards groaned under my weight, and I noticed that several of them were warped and stained with dark patches that looked suspiciously like dried blood, though I immediately tried to convince myself it was just rust from old nails. No doorbell was visible, so I knocked 3 times, the sound echoing strangely in the still air. The knock seemed to carry further than it should have, bouncing off invisible surfaces in the darkness beyond the porch. I waited, shifting my weight from foot to foot, acutely aware of how exposed I felt standing in that pool of porch light while everything around me remained hidden in impenetrable shadow. Minutes passed. I knocked again, harder this time, and called out that I had a delivery from Antonio's Pizza. My voice sounded small and fragile against the vastness of the night, and when the echo returned, it carried a quality I didn't recognize, as if something had subtly altered the sound before sending it back to me. Still no answer. I pulled out my phone to call the customer, remembering too late that I had no signal. The screen showed the time as 11:47 p.m., though my car's clock had read 10:30 when I'd arrived. Either one of them was wrong, or I'd lost nearly an hour and 20 minutes somewhere between parking and walking to the front door. My skin began to crawl with the unmistakable sensation of being observed. The feeling started as a slight prickle at the base of my neck, but quickly spread across my shoulders and down my arms. I turned slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the porch light's reach, but saw nothing except the vague shapes of trees and what might have been farm equipment in the distance. That's when I noticed the scarecrow. It stood roughly 50 feet away, positioned in what appeared to be a cornfield, though the stalks around it seemed stunted and wrong somehow. The figure was constructed in the traditional manner, a wooden cross for a frame, stuffed clothes, and a burlap sack head crowned with an old fedora. But something about its proportions seemed off, as if whoever had built it had only a vague understanding of human anatomy. I decided to try the back of the house, reasoning that rural customers often use their rear entrances more frequently than the front. The path around the side of the building was narrow and overgrown, forcing me to brush against the house's siding as I made my way toward what I hoped would be a back door. The paint felt wet under my fingertips, though when I pulled my hand away and examined it in the light from my phone's flashlight, my fingers were clean. The backyard opened up into a more expansive view of the farmland, and I could see that the property stretched much further than I'd initially realized. Fields extended in every direction, disappearing into the darkness like a vast ocean of agricultural void. More scarecrows dotted the landscape, each one standing sentinel over its designated section of crops. Something about their positioning bothered me. They seemed to be facing inward, toward the house, rather than outward to ward off whatever threats might approach from the wilderness beyond. A back door did exist, and I approached it with renewed hope. The pizza bags now feeling significantly heavier than they had 20 minutes earlier. This door was painted red, though the color had faded to a deep rust that made it nearly indistinguishable from dried blood in the poor light. I knocked again, calling out my presence, and was surprised when the door swung open slightly at my touch. The customer had apparently left it unlocked for me, though no note or instructions were visible. I called out again, explaining that I had their pizza delivery, but received no response from the darkened interior. The smart thing would have been to leave the pizzas on the doorstep and call it a night, but the hefty tip on this order represented nearly half my rent money, and I wasn't about to forfeit it over some misplaced nervousness. I pushed the door open further and stepped inside, immediately regretting the decision. The air inside the house was thick and humid, carrying that same organic smell I'd noticed outside, but concentrated to an almost suffocating degree. My flashlight beam revealed a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s, with yellowed linoleum floors and appliances that belonged in a museum. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, as if the house had been abandoned for months. But the most disturbing detail was the condition of the floor. My footsteps left clear impressions in what I'd initially taken for dust, but now realized was something far more unsettling. The substance had the consistency of topsoil, rich and dark and slightly damp. It clung to the soles of my shoes and released small clouds of particulates with each step, making me cough and cover my nose with my free hand. I called out once more, my voice now hoarse from the dust and growing panic. The sound seemed to be absorbed by the house itself, as if the walls were lined with something that prevented echoes. I set the pizza bags on the kitchen counter, trying to convince myself that leaving them here would fulfill my obligation and allow me to escape this increasingly nightmarish situation. As I turned to leave, movement outside the kitchen window caught my eye. The scarecrow I'd noticed earlier, the one in the cornfield, had changed position. Where it had been facing away from the house before, it now stood turned toward the building. Its burlap face pointed directly at the window where I stood. The distance made it impossible to discern features, but I had the unmistakable impression that it was looking at me. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Wind could have turned it. The angle of my observation had changed. I was simply mistaken about its original position. But my body knew better, flooding my system with adrenaline that made my hands shake and my heart hammer against my ribs like a caged animal desperate for escape. I backed away from the window, my movement triggering a cascade of small sounds throughout the house. Creaks and groans, and what sounded like rustling fabric from upstairs. The customer was home after all, I told myself, probably just sleeping and unaware of my arrival. But even as I formed this thought, I knew it wasn't true. Those sounds weren't human footsteps or the normal settling of an old house. They were something else entirely, something that made every primitive instinct in my brain scream warnings. The smart thing would have been to run, to abandon the pizzas, sprint to my car, and drive away as fast as possible. But I found myself frozen in place, staring out that kitchen window at the scarecrow that couldn't possibly have moved, but undeniably had. My breathing became shallow and rapid, each inhalation bringing more of that suffocating organic smell into my lungs. That's when I saw the scarecrow's hand move. It was a subtle motion, just a slight flexing of what should have been inanimate fabric and stuffing. But in the stark illumination of my flashlight beam, I could clearly see the sewn fingers curl and uncurl, in a gesture that was unmistakably beckoning. The movement was jerky and unnatural, like a marionette operated by someone still learning how to manipulate the strings. My knees nearly buckled. The flashlight beam wavered in my trembling grip, casting dancing shadows that made the entire scene shimmer with unreality. I blinked hard, hoping to clear whatever hallucination was overtaking me. But when I opened my eyes, the scarecrow had moved closer. Not by much, perhaps 10 feet, but enough to confirm that I wasn't imagining things. It now stood at the edge of the cornfield, well within the circle of light cast by the kitchen window. And in this improved illumination, I could see details that made my stomach lurch with revulsion. The scarecrow's clothes weren't just old, they were rotting. What I'd taken for faded fabric was actually organic matter in various stages of decomposition. held together by coarse stitching that looked disturbingly similar to surgical sutures. The burlap head was stained with dark patches that could have been moisture damage but looked far too much like dried blood for comfort. And then it spoke. The voice didn't come from the scarecrow itself, but seemed to emanate from the very air around me, a whispered request that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my skull. It asked for another slice of pizza, the words delivered with the casual expectation of someone continuing a conversation we'd never started. My grip on the flashlight failed entirely. The device clattered to the floor, its beam spinning wildly before settling on a position that cast my own shadow, elongated and distorted, across the kitchen wall. In that shadow, I could see movement that didn't correspond to my own frozen stillness, shapes that writhed and twisted like living things trying to escape the confines of their two-dimensional prison. The rustling sounds from upstairs intensified, joined now by similar noises from the basement, and what sounded like scratching within the walls themselves. The house was coming alive around me, filled with presence that defied explanation or rational thought. I could feel eyes watching me from every direction, not just the scarecrow outside, but countless others hidden in the shadows, studying my every movement with patient, predatory interest. I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the back door with clumsy desperation. But each step seemed to require enormous effort, as if the air itself had thickened into something resembling molasses. My lungs burned with each breath, and dark spots began to dance at the edges of my vision. The organic smell had become overwhelming, no longer just unpleasant but actively toxic, poisoning me with each inhalation. Behind me, I could hear the pizza boxes being opened. The sound of cardboard flaps being lifted was followed by what could only be described as feeding noises. Wet, hungry sounds that suggested mouths and teeth and digestive processes that bore no resemblance to normal human eating. Multiple entities seemed to be partaking, their consumption accompanied by satisfied sighs and the occasional grunt of appreciation. I reached the back door and fumbled for the handle, my coordination compromised by panic and whatever toxin I was breathing. The metal felt burning hot against my palm, though my rational mind insisted it should be cool. Behind me, the feeding noises grew louder and more enthusiastic, joined by new sounds that suggested the meal was being shared among an ever-growing number of participants. The door finally gave way, and I stumbled out into the night air, gasping like a drowning man breaking the surface, but the relief was short-lived. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized that every scarecrow in the surrounding fields had moved. They now formed a loose circle around the house, all facing inward, all perfectly still except for the occasional twitch of a hand or turn of a head, and they were all closer than they had been before. My car seemed impossibly distant, though I knew I'd parked it less than 100 feet away. The ground beneath my feet had become even more unstable, each step requiring careful balance to avoid sinking into what felt like quicksand disguised as farmland. Behind me, the feeding sounds continued, now accompanied by what sounded like satisfied conversation, though the words were too muffled and distorted to understand. I began to run, or at least attempted to. My movements felt sluggish and uncoordinated, as if I were moving underwater or in a dream where physics operated under different rules. The scarecrows watched my progress with patient interest, their positions shifting slightly to track my movement, but never quite moving when I was looking directly at them. My car key felt foreign in my hand when I finally reached the vehicle, the metal cold and somehow heavier than it should have been. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers too unsteady to insert the key properly on the first several attempts. When the door finally opened, I practically fell into the driver's seat, immediately locking the doors and starting the engine with desperate urgency. The headlights, when they flicked on, revealed that the scarecrows had moved again. They now stood in a perfect line across the driveway, blocking my exit route. But as I put the car in drive and pressed the accelerator, they stepped aside with eerie synchronization, creating a path just wide enough for my vehicle to pass through. I drove between them with my foot pressed to the floor, not daring to look in the rearview mirror until I'd put several miles between myself and that cursed farmhouse. When I finally did glance back, I saw nothing but empty road stretching behind me, lit by my own taillights and seemingly normal in every way. The GPS, when it finally regained signal, showed no record of Harvest Moon Lane. According to the satellite data, I'd spent the last 2 hours driving through the middle of a nature preserve where no roads or buildings existed. My manager, when I called to report the failed delivery, insisted that no order had been placed for that address and that our system showed no record of any transaction matching the one I described. But when I checked my pocket, I found a $20 bill that hadn't been there before. Crisp and new, smelling faintly of rich soil and decay, and in my car's cup holder, discovered the next morning, sat a single kernel of corn, still attached to a small section of cob that looked like it had been gnawed by teeth far sharper than any human possessed. I quit the delivery job the following week and moved to a different state entirely. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is particularly strong, I swear I can still hear that whispered voice asking for another slice, followed by the wet, satisfied sounds of feeding that no earthly mouth should be able to make. And I've learned to avoid driving past farm fields after dark, because I know now that some hungers can never truly be satisfied, and some deliveries are meant for customers who exist in the spaces between our world and somewhere far more terrible. Story 7. And the fog rolled in like a living thing, breathing against my windshield with wet, desperate fingers. I should have turned back when the GPS lost signal 30 miles ago, when the asphalt gave way to gravel, when the last cell tower disappeared behind me like a severed lifeline. But something pulled me forward along this nameless coastal road, a magnetic wrongness that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. The rental car's engine coughed once, twice, then died with a wheeze that sounded almost relieved. I sat in the sudden silence, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, listening to the tick of cooling metal and something else. A distant, rhythmic sound that could have been waves or breathing or both. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stepped out into air so thick with salt and something else, something organic and wrong, that it clung to my tongue like syrup. The fog pressed against me from all sides, a suffocating embrace that made my skin crawl with phantom sensations of being touched by invisible hands. I had come here following a lead on my missing brother, following rumors of a coastal town that didn't appear on any map, where people went to disappear. The locals in the last real town had grown quiet when I mentioned it, their eyes sliding away like oil on water. One old man had warned me about the singing, but I dismissed it as small-town superstition. Now, standing in this primordial soup of mist and dread, I wished I'd listened. The sound came again, not waves, but voices. Human voices raised in harmony, drifting through the fog like smoke from a distant fire. My chest tightened, and I found myself walking toward the sound before my rational mind could protest. Each step felt like walking deeper underwater, the pressure building in my ears until they popped with small, wet sounds. The voices grew clearer as I walked, though the words remained unintelligible, a language that felt older than language should be, syllables that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly in my bones. My breathing became shallow, rapid, each inhalation burning my lungs with salt, and an ozone smell that reminded me of lightning strikes and deep ocean trenches. Through the fog, shapes began to emerge. Human silhouettes standing in perfect formation, their bodies swaying gently as they sang. Relief flooded through me so suddenly that my knees nearly buckled. People, civilization, someone who could tell me where I was, help me find my way back to the main road. But as I drew closer, my relief curdled into something cold and sick in my stomach. The figures weren't moving naturally. Their sway was too uniform, too mechanical, like puppets dancing on the same string. And their faces. Christ, their faces were wrong. White, pure white, as if carved from chalk or bleached bone. Not painted white, not diseased white, but the white of things that had never known color, never known life. Their eyes were holes filled with shadow, their mouths perfect circles of darkness from which that inhuman singing poured. My feet kept moving forward, even as every nerve in my body screamed at me to run. The fog seemed to part before me, creating a corridor that led directly to the circle of singers. I could feel their eyeless gazes fixed on me, could feel their attention like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. Closer now, I could see they weren't breathing. Their chests didn't rise and fall. No mist emerged from their mouths despite the cold. Yet still they sang, their voices weaving together in harmonies that made my vision swim and my inner ear throb with pressure. Then I saw what they held in their hands. Shells. Large, spiraled conch shells pressed against their lips like ancient trumpets. The sound wasn't coming from their throats at all. It was emerging from those shells, voices pouring out of them like water from a broken dam. But whose voices? And how? My mouth went dry as cotton. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold, rolling down my face in hot tracks that felt like tears. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my fingertips, in the soles of my feet. One of the figures turned its head toward me with a motion so slow and deliberate, it seemed to take hours. Its face was completely smooth. No nose, no eyebrows, no features at all except for those black holes where eyes should be, and the perfect circle of its mouth. When it spoke, the words came from the shell in its hands, not from its lips. "Join us," the shell whispered, and the voice was familiar, heartbreakingly familiar. My brother's voice, but hollow, echoing, as if it were being filtered through fathoms of seawater. I stumbled backward, my legs feeling like rubber, but the fog had closed in behind me. There was nowhere to go but forward, into the circle of white figures with their terrible shells and their impossible songs. Another figure turned, then another. Each one spoke with a voice from the shells, and each voice belonged to someone I knew. Childhood friends, co-workers, people who had gone missing over the years. All of them speaking in unison now, all of them calling my name, beckoning me forward. "Join us," they said, and their shells gleamed wetly in the diffused light. Join the song, join the salt, join forever. I wanted to scream, but my throat had sealed shut. I wanted to run, but my legs moved me forward with their own terrible purpose. The singing grew louder, more complex, harmonies layering upon harmonies until the sound became a living thing that wrapped around my mind and squeezed. And then I was inside the circle. The moment I crossed the threshold, the fog lifted like a curtain being drawn back, and I could see everything with horrible clarity. The figures weren't people at all. They were statues, carved from what looked like white stone but felt wrong, organic somehow. Salt, I realized with a horror that started in my toes and worked its way up. They were made of salt. But the singing continued, pouring from their shells in voices I recognized, voices of the lost and the missing and the disappeared. The shells themselves seemed to pulse with internal light, like bioluminescent creatures from the deep ocean. I reached out with a trembling hand to touch the nearest figure, and its surface crumbled slightly under my fingers. Salt. Pure salt, warm to the touch and somehow yielding, as if there were something soft and alive beneath the crystalline surface. The figure's head turned to look at me, though it had no eyes to see with. Its mouth hole stretched wider, and my brother's voice emerged from the shell in its hands. Clearer now, more desperate. "Help!" the shell pleaded in my brother's voice. "Help us! Can't leave! Can't stop singing! Can't—" The voice cut off as another figure raised its shell, and a different voice emerged. My grandmother's voice, dead for 15 years. Then another and another. A chorus of the dead and the missing and the trapped, all singing that alien song through shells that served as their prisons and their voices. My vision started to tunnel. Black spots danced at the edges of my sight, and I could feel my own voice being drawn out of my throat, pulled toward one of the empty shells that lay scattered at the circle's center. My knees hit the ground hard, sending shockwaves of pain up my legs, but even that seemed distant and unimportant compared to the terrible suction I felt in my chest, in my throat, in the very core of who I was. The salt figures began to move, stepping closer with their inhuman mechanical grace. Their shells gleamed and pulsed, hungry for new voices, new songs to add to their eternal chorus. I could feel myself becoming hollow, feel my identity being siphoned away note by note. But then, a moment of clarity, sharp as broken glass. The fog swirled, and I saw a gap in the circle, a space between two figures where the mist was thinner. My body moved without conscious thought, pure survival instinct overriding the supernatural compulsion that had brought me here. I threw myself toward the gap, crawling when my legs wouldn't work, dragging myself across ground that felt soft and yielding like flesh. Behind me, the singing rose to a crescendo that made my ears bleed, made my vision strobe with impossible colors. The moment I crossed the circle's boundary, the world snapped back into focus. The fog rolled in again, thick and concealing, and the singing faded to a distant whisper. But I could still hear the voices calling my name, still hear my brother pleading for help through lips of shell and salt. I ran, stumbled, fell, picked myself up, and ran again. My car was where I'd left it, though it felt like I'd been gone for hours or days. The engine started on the first try, and I drove blind through the fog, following the gravel road by feel and prayer, until I saw the blessed glow of electric streetlights through the mist. I didn't stop driving until I reached the city, until I was surrounded by concrete and steel and the comfortable noise of human civilization. But even now, weeks later, I can still hear that singing in quiet moments. I can still feel the pull of those shells, calling me back to join the eternal chorus. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if I really escaped at all. Sometimes I catch myself humming along to a tune I don't recognize, feel my throat vibrating with harmonies that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I look in the mirror and see my reflection growing paler, more translucent, as if I'm slowly becoming salt myself. The authorities found no record of the coastal town I described. The GPS showed no deviation from the main highway. They suggested stress, hallucinations, carbon monoxide poisoning from my car's exhaust. But they couldn't explain the salt I keep finding in my pockets, in my shoes, under my fingernails. Salt that tastes of the ocean and sounds like singing when it dissolves on my tongue. My brother is still missing. The voices in the shells are still singing. And somewhere along that nameless coast, wrapped in fog and impossibility, the circle waits for new voices to join their eternal song. I write this as a warning, though I know few will believe. Stay away from coastal roads that don't appear on maps. Ignore the singing in the fog. And if you ever find yourself in a circle of salt figures with shells for voices, remember that some prisons are made not of bars, but of songs that never end. The salt remembers everything. The shells preserve every voice they've ever swallowed, and somewhere in that chorus of the lost, my brother's voice still calls for help. A help I was too afraid to give, a rescue I was too weak to attempt. The singing follows me now, a constant whisper at the edge of hearing, and I know, with growing certainty, that one day I'll follow that whisper back to its source. One day the pull will be too strong to resist, and I'll take my place in the circle, my voice joining the eternal harmony that binds the salt figures in their endless hollow song. Until then, I wait. I listen. And I taste salt in everything I eat, in everything I drink, in every breath I take. The ocean calls, and the shells sing, and somewhere in the fog, my brother waits for me to come home. Story 8. The ocean never lies, but sometimes it shows truths we're not meant to see. I should have turned the yacht around the moment I spotted that impossible thing floating in the distance. But curiosity, that fatal human flaw, pulled me forward like a fish toward a lure. The Mediterranean sun hung low that evening, painting the waters in shades of amber and blood, when I first glimpsed what I initially mistook for a mirage. My hands trembled against the yacht's steering wheel as I cut the engines, letting the Serafina drift closer to the anomaly. The silence that followed felt dense, oppressive, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against our hull. My breath caught in my throat as the object came into focus. A boat, or something resembling one, crafted entirely from what appeared to be liquid glass. Its surface rippled and flowed like mercury, yet maintained the unmistakable shape of a vessel, complete with a mast that seemed to bend and straighten with each passing wave. The thing floated impossibly on the water's surface, neither sinking nor riding the waves naturally. Instead, it moved with an otherworldly grace, as if the laws of physics held no dominion over its crystalline form. My pulse quickened, hammering against my ribs with increasing intensity. Every rational part of my mind screamed warnings, urged me to start the engines and flee. But something deeper, something primal and hungry for understanding, kept me frozen in place. I had been sailing alone for 3 days, seeking solitude after the bitter divorce proceedings that had left me hollow and questioning everything I thought I knew about life. The Serafina had been my escape, my sanctuary from the lawyers and the accusations and the slow dissolution of 20 years of marriage. But now, faced with this impossible sight, my personal troubles seemed insignificant, childish even. The glass boat drifted closer, and I noticed something that made my skin crawl with goosebumps. Its surface acted as a mirror, but not in any conventional sense. Where I expected to see my own reflection staring back, I saw something far more disturbing. The figure in the glass looked like me, same weathered face, same salt and pepper beard, same deep-set brown eyes, but older, decades older. The man in the reflection bore the weight of years I had yet to live, his face carved with lines of experience and suffering that hadn't yet touched my own skin. My legs felt unsteady beneath me as I gripped the yacht's railing. The reflection man's mouth moved silently, as if trying to communicate something urgent across the barrier of time and glass. His eyes held a desperate intensity that made my stomach clench with dread. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool evening breeze, and my breathing became shallow and rapid. I forced myself to look away, blinking hard and shaking my head to clear the impossible vision. When I looked back, the reflection had changed. Now the older version of myself appeared even more aged, his hair white as bone, his face gaunt and marked by deep worry lines. His hands, which mirrored my own movements as I gripped the railing, were gnarled and spotted with age. But it was his eyes that truly terrified me. They held a knowledge, a terrible understanding of something that hadn't yet come to pass. The glass vessel continued its impossible dance on the waves, each movement causing the reflection to shift and change. Sometimes the older me appeared to be shouting soundlessly. Other times he simply stared with an expression of profound sadness that made my chest ache with phantom grief. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out even the sound of the ocean. I tried to move away from the railing, to retreat into the yacht's cabin, but found myself paralyzed by the sight. The reflection had become addictive, each glimpse revealing new details about a future I was apparently destined to live. In one particularly disturbing moment, I watched the aged version of myself gesture frantically toward something behind him, something I couldn't see but that clearly filled him with terror. The sun continued its descent, casting longer shadows across the water. As darkness began to claim the sky, the glass boat seemed to glow with an internal light, making the reflections even more vivid and disturbing. My mouth had gone completely dry, and my hands shook so violently I had to clench them into fists to maintain any semblance of control. I attempted to convince myself that exhaustion was playing tricks on my mind. 3 days of solitude, minimal sleep, and the emotional strain of recent events could easily cause hallucinations. But the reflection's consistency, its detailed and evolving nature, defied such rational explanations. The older me in the glass continued to age with each wave that passed beneath the vessel, sometimes appearing to be in his 70s, sometimes his 80s, sometimes so ancient that his features became barely recognizable. Then came the moment that shattered what remained of my skepticism. The reflection suddenly stopped aging and began moving independently of my actions. While I stood motionless at the railing, the figure in the glass turned and pointed directly at me, his mouth forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood with chilling clarity. "Don't look." Ice flooded my veins. My legs nearly buckled as the full implications hit me. This wasn't just showing me possible futures. It was showing me the consequences of witnessing them. The older me in the reflection wasn't just aged by time. He was aged by knowledge, by the terrible burden of having seen too much. I stumbled backward from the railing, my vision blurring with panic-induced tears. My breathing came in short, desperate gasps, as if the air itself had become too thin. The yacht seemed to rock more violently now, though the sea remained relatively calm. Every shadow appeared to move with menace, and I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, expecting to find some unseen presence lurking behind me. The glass boat had somehow drifted even closer, near enough now that I could make out intricate details in its impossible construction. Veins of darker material ran through the liquid glass like blood vessels, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my own racing heartbeat. The reflection showed the ancient version of myself, now hunched and broken, his hands pressed against the glass as if trying to break through from the other side. I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the yacht's controls with unsteady steps. My fingers fumbled with the ignition, slick with sweat and trembling uncontrollably. The engines coughed to life, their familiar rumble providing a small measure of comfort in the midst of my terror. But as I turned the wheel to steer away from the glass vessel, I made the mistake of glancing back one final time. The reflection had changed completely. Now it showed not just an aged version of myself, but multiple versions, dozens of them, all at different stages of advanced age, all staring out with expressions of accumulated horror. They moved independently, some reaching out desperately, others covering their faces in apparent anguish. In the center of this crowd of future selves stood one figure that made my blood freeze completely. Myself as I was in that very moment, young and terrified, staring back at the man I was becoming. The realization hit like a physical blow. This wasn't just showing me the future, it was creating it. Each moment I spent looking into that cursed reflection was adding years to my life, aging me with the weight of forbidden knowledge. The terror of understanding accelerated my aging process, creating a feedback loop that would eventually transform me into one of those desperate, ancient figures trapped in the glass. With strength born of pure survival instinct, I wrenched my gaze away and gunned the engines. The Serafina lurched forward, cutting through the waves with desperate speed. Behind me, I could sense, rather than see the glass boat following, its impossible form keeping pace despite having no visible means of propulsion. The sound of waves breaking against both vessels created an unsettling rhythm that seemed to whisper my name. I didn't dare look back again, not even when the sounds of pursuit finally faded into the distance. Instead, I focused on the horizon ahead, on the promise of harbor lights and solid ground, and the blessed normalcy of a world where glass boats didn't float, and reflections didn't show forbidden futures. But even as I sailed toward safety, I could feel the changes beginning in my body. A subtle stiffness in my joints, a slight dimming of my vision, the first gray threads appearing in my hair, as if time itself was accelerating around me. By the time I reached port 3 hours later, I looked 10 years older than when I had started the day. The harbor master who helped me dock commented on how tired I appeared, how much the sailing trip seemed to have aged me. He suggested I see a doctor, mentioned that stress could do terrible things to a man's appearance. I nodded and thanked him for his concern, but I knew no doctor could explain what had happened to me out there. As I walked away from the yacht, I caught my reflection in the harbor office window and saw the truth that would haunt me for whatever remained of my unnaturally shortened life. The man staring back was already showing the first signs of becoming one of those desperate figures trapped in the glass. The ocean never lies, but sometimes the truth it reveals is too terrible to bear. And sometimes, once you've seen your future, there's no escaping the weight of that knowledge. It ages you from the inside out, day by day, until you become exactly what you witnessed in that cursed reflection. I never sailed alone again, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. The glass boat had shown me my future, and now I was living it, one prematurely aged day at a time. Story 9. The salt-heavy wind cut through my jacket like frozen razor blades, and somewhere in the distance, the lighthouse beam swept across the churning black water with mechanical indifference. I should have trusted my gut when Marcus first pitched the idea of nighttime photography sessions on this godforsaken stretch of coastline, but the money he offered was too good to pass up, and my rent was 3 weeks overdue. Now, standing on the rocky outcropping as midnight approached, every instinct screamed that I'd made a terrible mistake. The waves below crashed against the jagged shore with a violence that seemed personal, angry, as if the ocean itself resented our presence. Marcus had been setting up his equipment for the past hour, his movements precise and methodical in a way that made my skin crawl. There was something off about how he handled that vintage camera, stroking its metal body like it was alive. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched him adjust the tripod one final time. The man barely spoke during our drive here, just hummed under his breath and tapped his fingers against the steering wheel in patterns that reminded me of Morse code. When I'd asked about his previous work, he'd simply smiled and mentioned that his photographs captured things most people couldn't see with the naked eye. At the time, I'd assumed he meant he was good at finding interesting angles or lighting. Now, surrounded by the oppressive darkness of this isolated coast, those words took on a more sinister meaning. The first flash erupted like artificial lightning, temporarily burning away the night and leaving purple after-images dancing across my vision. I blinked hard, trying to clear my sight, and that's when I noticed it, a shadow behind me in the brief moment of illumination, tall and impossibly thin, where nothing should have been standing. My neck muscles tensed as I spun around, but found only empty space and the endless expanse of churning water beyond the cliff edge. Marcus lowered his camera and examined the back of it with satisfaction, as if he'd captured exactly what he'd been hoping for. When I mentioned seeing something in the flash, he just nodded knowingly and suggested we continue. His casual dismissal made my mouth go dry with unease. The wind picked up, carrying with it the acrid smell of rotting seaweed and something else, something metallic and organic that made my stomach lurch. The second flash came without warning, and this time the shadow was closer. Much closer. I could make out details that shouldn't have been possible in that split second of illumination. Elongated fingers that ended in points, a head that tilted at an unnatural angle, and a posture that suggested it had been watching me for far longer than I'd been aware of its presence. My breathing became shallow and rapid, as cold sweat broke out across my forehead, despite the frigid air. When I demanded to know what was happening, Marcus simply adjusted his camera settings and mentioned that some subjects required patience to reveal themselves properly. His voice carried an excitement that made my spine tingle with dread. The way he said subjects suggested he wasn't just talking about me, and the realization that I might not be the only thing he was photographing sent ice through my veins. Between shots, Marcus would walk to the edge of the rocks and retrieve objects that the waves had deposited there. Film negatives, he explained when I asked, left behind by previous sessions. The way he handled them, with a reverence bordering on worship, made my hands shake. When he held them up to the lighthouse beam for examination, I caught glimpses of the images they contained, figures that looked human at first glance but possessed features that belonged in nightmares. My own image appeared in every frame, but there was something fundamentally wrong with my eyes in each photograph. Where my pupils should have been, there was only white, as if someone had carefully painted over them or as if they'd never existed at all. The sight made my vision blur with panic, and I had to grip the rocky surface beneath me to keep from swaying. Marcus noticed my distress and assured me that this was perfectly normal for subjects who were transitioning, though he refused to elaborate on what that meant. The third flash revealed not one shadow but three, arranged in a semicircle behind me like silent sentinels. They seemed to pulse with their own dark energy, and I could swear I felt their attention boring into the back of my skull like drill bits. My entire body began to tremble uncontrollably, and the taste of copper filled my mouth as if I'd bitten my tongue. The rational part of my mind insisted that this was all some elaborate trick, a setup involving hidden projectors or accomplices, but my gut knew better. Marcus became increasingly animated as the session progressed, muttering to himself about excellent manifestations and unprecedented clarity. He moved around me in a circle, capturing images from different angles, and with each flash, the shadows seemed to grow more solid, more real. I could hear them now, a low humming that seemed to come from inside my own head, building in intensity until it drowned out the sound of the crashing waves. The negatives that washed up after each round of photographs showed a progression that filled me with mounting horror. In the earliest ones, the shadows were barely visible, like smudges or defects in the film. But as the night wore on, they became increasingly defined, taking on humanoid shapes that somehow managed to be both familiar and utterly alien. Worse still, my own image seemed to be fading with each frame, becoming increasingly transparent until I appeared more like a ghost than a living person. When I tried to leave, I discovered that my legs wouldn't obey me. They felt heavy and unresponsive, as if I'd been standing in freezing water for hours. Marcus noticed my distress and explained that subjects often experience temporary paralysis during the capturing process. The way he said it suggested this was neither the first time he'd witnessed such a reaction, nor something he considered problematic. The lighthouse beam seemed to be moving faster now, or perhaps time itself was becoming distorted. Each sweep of light brought fresh revelations, more shadows, stranger shapes, and the growing certainty that whatever was happening to me was irreversible. My reflection in the camera's lens showed eyes that were already beginning to lose their color, pupils fading to the same empty white I'd seen in the photographs. The final series of flashes came in rapid succession, and with each burst of light the shadows pressed closer. I could feel their presence as a physical weight, cold and suffocating, pressing against my back and shoulders. The humming in my head reached a crescendo that made my ears ring and my vision blur. Marcus was practically dancing now, capturing frame after frame with manic enthusiasm, and I realized with crystalline clarity that I had never been his client. I had always been his subject. The negatives that emerged from the final wave were different from all the others. In these, the shadows had faces. My face, repeated dozens of times, each one slightly different but unmistakably me. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say they were what I was becoming. The me in the photographs grew increasingly hollow-eyed and translucent, while the shadow versions became more solid and defined, as if we were trading places one flash at a time. When feeling finally returned to my legs, I ran. I stumbled and fell repeatedly on the rocky terrain, tearing my clothes and scraping my hands raw. But I didn't stop until I reached Marcus's car. The keys were still in the ignition, and I drove away without looking back, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white. But even now, 3 days later, I can't escape what happened on that cliff. The negatives follow me, appearing in my mailbox, slipped under my door, floating in my bathtub. Each one shows the progression continuing, my features growing fainter while theirs become more distinct. Sometimes I catch glimpses of them in mirrors or reflective surfaces, standing behind me with eyes that are no longer white but deep and knowing. The worst part isn't the fear or the confusion. It's the growing certainty that Marcus was right about one thing. The process isn't finished yet. Every night, I feel myself becoming less solid, more translucent, while somewhere out there on that rocky coastline, my other selves grow stronger and more real. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, I find myself humming the same rhythm Marcus used to tap against his steering wheel, my fingers moving in patterns I don't remember learning but somehow know by heart. Story 10. The ocean shouldn't retreat from love. That thought hammered against my skull as I watched the impossible tide pull back beyond the reef, leaving behind wet sand that gleamed like black glass under the failing torchlight. Something was fundamentally wrong with this place, with this moment, with the very air that tasted of salt and decay. I should have known better than to trust Marcus when he suggested Bali for Sarah's destination wedding. The man had always possessed an unsettling fascination with what he called authentic cultural experiences, which usually meant dragging our group to places where tourists feared to tread. But Sarah had been enchanted by his description of the secluded beach ceremony, the traditional Balinese elements, the mystical romance of exchanging vows where ancient spirits supposedly blessed unions. Standing there now, watching the bamboo torches flicker and die one by one despite the absence of wind, I felt my stomach clench with a dread so profound it seemed to emanate from my bones. The wedding party huddled closer together as darkness crept across the beach like spilled ink. My shirt clung to my back, soaked through with cold sweat that had nothing to do with the tropical humidity. The ceremony had begun normally enough. Sarah looked radiant in her flowing white dress, Tom beamed with nervous excitement, and the Balinese priest chanted in melodious tones that seemed to float on the evening air. Frangipani blossoms scattered across the sand created a fragrant carpet, while the setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. But then the first torch died. It didn't sputter or fade gradually as flames naturally do. One moment it burned bright and steady. The next it simply ceased to exist. as if someone had thrown a switch. The priest's chanting faltered for just a heartbeat before continuing, but I caught the brief flicker of confusion that crossed his weathered features. My pulse quickened as a second torch extinguished itself, then a third. The remaining flames danced wildly now, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The shadows stretched and writhed across the sand, forming shapes that my rational mind insisted were merely tricks of failing light, but which my primitive brain recognized as something far more sinister. Sarah's face had gone pale, though she maintained her smile with admirable determination. Tom kept glancing nervously at the dying torches, his jaw working as if he were grinding his teeth. The other guests shifted restlessly, their earlier jovial chatter reduced to nervous whispers that carried an undercurrent of mounting anxiety. I found myself focusing on my breathing, trying to combat the sensation that the air had grown thicker, more difficult to draw into my lungs. Each inhale felt labored, as if I were breathing through wet cloth. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped them together, knuckles white with tension. The priest's voice grew louder, more insistent, as if he were trying to rush through the remaining portions of the ceremony. But even as he spoke the traditional words of binding, the shadows on the sand began to shift and flow in patterns that defied explanation. They moved with purpose, forming intricate designs that seemed almost familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen such symbols before. My throat felt parched despite the humid air, and I swallowed repeatedly, trying to generate enough saliva to speak if necessary. The metallic taste of fear coated my tongue, bitter and sharp. Around me, other guests began to notice the strange shadow formations, their whispered concerns growing more urgent. Marcus stood to my left, his face bearing an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of fascination and something that might have been recognition. When I leaned toward him to voice my growing unease, he simply shook his head and held up a hand for silence, his eyes never leaving the dancing shadows. The patterns in the sand became more complex, more deliberate. They formed intersecting circles and angular lines that spoke of ancient knowledge and forgotten rituals. My skin crawled as I realized these weren't random shapes cast by flickering flames. They were symbols, carefully drawn by shadows that moved with intelligence and intent. The ocean, which had been lapping gently at the shore throughout the ceremony, began to behave strangely. Instead of the rhythmic advance and retreat of normal waves, the water seemed to be pulling back steadily, withdrawing from the beach as if repelled by what was happening on the sand. The tide receded far beyond its natural limit, exposing areas of seabed that should have remained submerged. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force I was certain others could hear it. The retreat of the ocean felt like a cosmic rejection, as if the very sea refused to witness what was unfolding. Fish flopped desperately in the newly exposed tidal pools, their silver bodies flashing in the dying torchlight like living distress signals. The priest's chanting had taken on a different quality now, urgent, almost pleading. He seemed to be addressing not just the couple before him, but some unseen presence that had joined the gathering. His hands moved in complex gestures that bore no resemblance to any wedding ceremony I'd ever witnessed, and beads of perspiration dotted his forehead despite the cooling evening air. As the last of the torches died, plunging us into a darkness relieved only by the pale light of a crescent moon, the shadow symbols on the sand began to glow with a faint phosphorescence. The ethereal light pulsed rhythmically, like a massive heartbeat, and I felt an answering throb in my temples that made me dizzy and nauseous. Sarah's bouquet slipped from her nerveless fingers, the tropical flowers scattering across the glowing symbols. Where the blossoms touched the phosphorescent lines, they withered instantly, their vibrant colors draining away until only desiccated husks remained. The sight sent a chill racing down my spine that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. I tried to step back, to put distance between myself and whatever force was manifesting on the beach, but my legs felt leaden and unresponsive. The sand beneath my feet had grown cold despite the day's accumulated warmth, and each step required tremendous effort, as if I were walking through thick mud rather than loose sand. The priest's voice rose to a crescendo, and suddenly the meaning of the shadow symbols became horrifyingly clear. My limited understanding of Indonesian script, gained from a college linguistics course, allowed me to parse the flowing characters that had formed in the phosphorescent sand. The words they spelled out made my blood freeze in my veins. Tingal Selamanya. Stay forever. The realization hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and leaving me gasping. This wasn't a wedding ceremony anymore. It was something else entirely, something ancient and hungry that had been waiting for the right combination of elements to manifest. The traditional Balinese blessing had become a binding of a far different nature. Tom and Sarah stood frozen at the center of the glowing symbols, their faces blank and expressionless, as if they were sleepwalking. The priest continued his chanting, but the words no longer sounded like any human language I recognized. They seemed to come from somewhere deep beneath the earth, resonating through the sand and into the bones of everyone present. My vision began to blur at the edges, and I felt a strange pulling sensation, as if invisible hands were trying to drag me forward into the phosphorescent circle. I dug my heels into the sand and leaned back, fighting against the compulsion with every ounce of strength I possessed. The effort left me trembling with exhaustion, my muscles screaming in protest. Around me, other guests were struggling with the same supernatural force. Some had already taken several steps toward the glowing symbols, their movements jerky and unnatural like marionettes controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Their eyes reflected the phosphorescent light, giving them an otherworldly appearance that sent fresh waves of terror coursing through my system. The ocean continued its retreat, pulling back so far that the exposed seabed stretched beyond the reach of moonlight. The absence of wave sounds created an oppressive silence broken only by the priest's inhuman chanting and the labored breathing of the wedding guests, as they fought against forces they couldn't understand. I noticed that Marcus was no longer struggling against the pull. He stood perfectly still, a serene smile playing across his lips as he watched the unfolding scene. When he turned to look at me, his eyes held a depth of knowledge that spoke of careful planning and deliberate orchestration. In that moment, I understood that we hadn't stumbled into this situation by accident. We had been led here, guided by someone who knew exactly what would happen when the right words were spoken in the right place at the right time. The phosphorescent symbols began to pulse faster, their rhythm matching my racing heartbeat. With each pulse, the pulling sensation grew stronger, more insistent. I could feel my resistance weakening as whatever force had been awakened concentrated its efforts on the assembled group. My legs began to move forward against my will, carrying me inch by inch toward the center of the pattern. Sarah and Tom remained motionless at the heart of the design, but their stillness was beginning to take on an unnatural quality. They breathed in perfect synchronization, their chests rising and falling in a rhythm that matched the pulsing of the symbols. Their skin had taken on a pale, translucent quality that reminded me of deep-sea creatures that had never seen sunlight. The priest's chanting reached a fever pitch, and suddenly the symbols flared with brilliant light that seared my retinas and left dancing afterimages burned into my vision. When my sight cleared, I found myself standing within the phosphorescent circle, surrounded by the other wedding guests who had been drawn in despite their struggles. But we were not alone. Figures had materialized at the edges of the pattern, translucent forms that might once have been human, but had been transformed by centuries of existence in this place. They moved with fluid grace around the perimeter of the symbols, their mouths open in silent screams or songs, their eyes fixed on the newcomers with an intensity that spoke of desperate hunger. I tried to cry out, to break the supernatural silence that had settled over the beach, but found that my voice had been stolen. My throat worked soundlessly, producing nothing but harsh gasps that barely qualified as whispers. The other guests appeared to be experiencing the same affliction, their mouths moving in pantomime shouts that carried no sound. The ghostly figures began to circle closer, their forms becoming more solid with each revolution. I could see details now that made my skin crawl. The tattered remains of clothing that spanned decades or possibly centuries of fashion, the hollow sockets where eyes should have been, the gaping wounds that had never healed properly in whatever twilight existence they now endured. My rational mind insisted that what I was experiencing couldn't be real, that stress and suggestion had combined to create an elaborate hallucination. But the cold sand beneath my feet, the salt taste of fear in my mouth, and the bone-deep chill that had settled into my marrow all testified to the horrifying reality of the situation. One of the spectral figures approached Sarah and Tom, extending arms that ended in fingers too long and too pointed to be entirely human. As those impossible hands reached toward the couple, I summoned every last reserve of strength and willpower to break free from whatever force held me in place. The effort was like trying to move through hardened concrete, but desperation gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I threw myself forward, tackling Tom and Sarah and sending all three of us tumbling out of the phosphorescent circle and onto the ordinary sand beyond its borders. The moment we crossed the line of symbols, the supernatural silence shattered like breaking glass. The ocean rushed back toward shore with a thunderous roar, erasing the glowing patterns and sending the ghostly figures fleeing back into whatever realm had spawned them. The torches flared back to life as if they had never been extinguished, casting normal shadows that danced in normal ways. Sarah gasped and shuddered as consciousness returned to her eyes, while Tom looked around in bewildered confusion, as if waking from a deep sleep. The other guests stumbled away from the circle, their voices returning in a cacophony of frightened questions and demands for explanation. But Marcus was nowhere to be found. In the chaos of the ocean's return and the re-establishment of normalcy, he had simply vanished, leaving behind only a small pile of sand that glittered with phosphorescent traces. The Balinese priest approached us with obvious relief, explaining in broken English that the ceremony had been interrupted by what he called hungry spirits, drawn by the combination of foreign emotions and sacred ground. He assured us that such things were rare but not unheard of, and that the marriage blessing could be completed the following day at a different location. As the shaken wedding party made its way back to the resort, I found myself unable to shake the memory of those desperate, yearning faces that had surrounded us in the circle. They had not been malevolent, I realized, but trapped, souls bound to that place by some ancient working that required periodic renewal through the capture of new victims. And Marcus, with his knowledge of authentic cultural experiences and his carefully orchestrated selection of this particular beach, had known exactly what would happen when the right words were spoken under the right conditions. The question that haunted me as we left the beach behind was whether he had been a willing participant in the supernatural trap, or simply another victim who had become its guardian through centuries of imprisonment. The ocean lapped peacefully at the shore once more, but I knew that somewhere beneath its placid surface, the phosphorescent symbols waited patiently for the next group of unsuspecting celebrants to gather at the water's edge. And Marcus, or whatever Marcus had become, would be there to guide them to that sacred and terrible place where the hungry spirits whispered their eternal invitation, "Stay forever." Story 11. The editing suite hummed with the mechanical persistence of computers that had been running too long, their fans whirring against the accumulated heat of another sleepless night. Empty energy drink cans formed a metallic graveyard across my desk, their acidic smell mixing with the stale air of a room that hadn't seen sunlight in days. The clock in the corner of my monitor glowed 3:47 a.m., but time had lost all meaning somewhere between the 100th and 101st viewing of the same footage. I was Marcus Chen, and I made my living salvaging other people's abandoned dreams. Independent filmmakers would hire me to edit their raw footage into something coherent, something sellable, something that might recoup even a fraction of their investment. Most of the time it was wedding videos or corporate training materials. Sometimes, if I was lucky, it was actual cinema, or at least something aspiring to be. This particular project had come to me through a referral from another editor who'd grown tired of dealing with difficult clients. The footage belonged to someone named David Reeves, who claimed to be working on an experimental horror film. He'd paid half up front and promised the rest upon completion, but had been impossible to reach for the past 2 weeks. His phone went straight to voicemail, his emails bounced back, and the address he'd given me led to an empty office space with 4 lease signs in every window. But the footage itself was compelling enough that I'd continued working, telling myself I'd figure out the payment situation later. There were roughly 40 hours of material spread across dozens of memory cards and hard drives, all labeled with cryptic dates and location codes that made no apparent sense. Most of it seemed to be establishing shots of an old warehouse district, the kind of post-industrial wasteland that independent filmmakers loved. for its gritty authenticity and non-existent location fees. The warehouse in question was a sprawling concrete monument to some long-dead manufacturing empire. Its windows had been broken out years ago, leaving jagged teeth of glass that caught the light in unsettling ways. Graffiti covered the lower walls in layers, each new artist attempting to claim their territory over the ghosts of previous vandals. Inside, the space was cavernous and echoing, filled with abandoned machinery that cast twisted shadows in whatever light managed to penetrate the gloom. What made the footage unusual was its obsessive thoroughness. Reeves had apparently filmed every corner of the building from every conceivable angle, creating a comprehensive visual map of decay and abandonment. There were hundreds of shots of the same rusted pipes, the same crumbling concrete walls, the same pools of stagnant water that reflected the sparse lighting like black mirrors. But it was when I reached the end of the batch I'd been working on that I noticed something strange. The final clip was supposed to be 3 minutes and 47 seconds long, according to the metadata. But when I played it back, it ran for 3 minutes and 52 seconds, 5 extra seconds that shouldn't have existed. My first instinct was to blame the editing software. Digital files could get corrupted, especially when they'd been transferred between different systems multiple times. But when I checked the original file, it showed the same discrepancy. The timestamp on my computer matched what the software was telling me, but the content extended beyond what should have been possible. Those extra 5 seconds showed something that made my chest tighten with inexplicable unease. The camera was positioned somewhere in the middle of the warehouse's main floor, pointing toward what appeared to be a makeshift film set. Someone had arranged several pieces of furniture in a rough approximation of a living room. A threadbare couch, a coffee table missing one leg, a floor lamp with a bent shade that cast uneven light across the concrete. It looked like the kind of set a film student might throw together on a non-existent budget, using whatever they could scavenge from thrift stores and dumpsters. But that wasn't what made my hands start to tremble as I gripped the edge of my desk. In those impossible 5 seconds, I could see a figure moving through the frame. The lighting was poor and the image quality grainy, but there was no mistaking the shape of a person walking between the furniture pieces, adjusting the lamp, testing the stability of the coffee table. The figure moved with purpose, like someone familiar with the space, someone who belonged there. The figure was me, not someone who looked like me, not a distant resemblance that my tired mind might have conjured from the pixelated darkness. It was unmistakably me, wearing the same black hoodie I had on at that very moment, the same worn jeans, even the same pair of white sneakers that I'd been meaning to replace for months. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched myself move through the abandoned warehouse, a place I had never been, doing things I had never done. The angle of the shot was impossible, positioned at a height and distance that would have required the camera to be suspended in midair, with no visible support structure. I rewound the clip and watched again. The extra seconds remained, showing the same impossible scene. My digital doppelganger continued his purposeful movements through the makeshift set, occasionally glancing up toward the camera with an expression I couldn't quite read from this distance. The third time I watched it, I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. In the final second of the extra footage, the figure that looked like me turned to face the camera directly. Even through the poor image quality, I could see him raise his hand in what might have been a wave, or might have been something else entirely. His mouth moved as if he were saying something, but there was no audio track attached to this particular file. I tried to tell myself there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe Reeves had hired an actor who resembled me. Maybe the footage had been corrupted in some way that created a visual artifact. Maybe I was more exhausted than I'd realized, and my mind was playing tricks on me in the perpetual twilight of my windowless editing suite. But when I opened the next file in the sequence, my rationalizations crumbled like the concrete walls in the warehouse. This clip was labeled as interior footage from a different section of the building, shot several days later according to the timestamp. It should have been straightforward B-roll material, the kind of atmospheric shots that would be useful for establishing mood and pacing. Instead, I found myself looking at nearly 6 minutes of footage that showed the same abandoned set from multiple angles. And in every single shot, there I was. Sometimes I was in the background, barely visible in the shadows between pieces of furniture. Sometimes I was the focus of the frame, moving with the confident familiarity of someone who'd been in this space many times before. I watched myself adjust lighting equipment I'd never seen, move props I'd never touched, and work with a sense of purpose that made no sense given that I'd never set foot in that warehouse. The angles were wrong in every shot. The camera positions were impossible, suspended in space or somehow attached to surfaces that couldn't support them. In one clip, the viewpoint seemed to be from directly above the set, looking down at a bird's-eye view of the furniture arrangement and my own figure moving between the pieces like a performer on a stage. But it was the expression on my face that disturbed me most. Even through the grainy footage and poor lighting, I could see that the other me looked tired. Not just physically exhausted, but worn down in a way that went deeper than sleepless nights and too much caffeine. There was something haunted in the way he moved, something desperate in the way he kept glancing toward the cameras that were recording him. Because that's what they were doing, recording, not filming a movie or capturing B-roll footage, but documenting something. The other me seemed aware of every camera position, seemed to be performing for an audience that consisted entirely of recording devices positioned at impossible angles throughout the abandoned space. I found myself checking the timestamps obsessively, cross-referencing them with my own calendar and work schedule. According to the metadata, this footage had been captured on dates when I could prove I'd been somewhere else entirely. I had receipts from restaurants, timestamps on social media posts, even security footage from my apartment building that confirmed I'd been nowhere near that warehouse. Yet there I was, clear as day, working on a film set I'd never seen before. As I continued through the files, the footage became more focused, more intentional. The cameras seemed to be following my movements with increasing precision, capturing every gesture and expression with an attention to detail that felt more like surveillance than cinematography. In some shots, multiple versions of the same scene played out from different angles, creating a disorienting kaleidoscope of perspectives that made my eyes water and my head pound. The other me seemed to grow more agitated as the footage progressed. He moved faster, with less care for the equipment around him. Several times I watched him pause in his work to stare directly into one of the impossible cameras, his mouth moving in what looked like urgent whispers that the audio-free footage couldn't convey. In one particularly disturbing sequence, I watched myself approach one of the cameras directly. The image quality was clear enough that I could see my own eyes staring back at me through the screen, wide with what looked like fear or desperation. The other me reached toward the camera as if trying to touch the lens, and for a moment the footage shook as if the recording device had been physically disturbed. Then the clip ended abruptly, cutting to black in a way that suggested the camera had been turned off manually rather than simply running out of storage space. My hands were shaking badly enough that I had to set down my coffee cup to avoid spilling it across my equipment. The rational part of my mind kept trying to construct explanations. Elaborate pranks, sophisticated deepfake technology, some kind of psychological experiment being conducted without my knowledge. But none of these theories could account for the sheer volume of footage or the consistency of the impossible camera angles. I tried calling the number David Reeves had given me, but it still went straight to a voicemail box that had been full for days. His email address continued to bounce back undelivered messages. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had no real evidence that David Reeves existed at all. The name could be fake, the contact information fabricated, the whole arrangement designed to get this footage into my hands for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. But why me? Why go to such elaborate lengths to show me footage of myself in a place I'd never been? The answer came in the final batch of files, the ones I almost didn't have the courage to open. These clips were different from the others. Instead of showing the abandoned warehouse set, they were shot in familiar locations. My apartment building, the coffee shop where I usually worked when I needed a change of scenery, even the grocery store where I did my weekly shopping. The timestamps indicated they'd been recorded over the past several months, a comprehensive documentation of my daily routines and habits. But in every single frame, there were cameras, not visible cameras, but the evidence of their presence, reflections in windows that showed impossible viewpoints, shadows that fell wrong for the available light sources, Perspective shifts that could only be explained by recording devices positioned in locations where no recording devices should be able to exist. I was being watched, had been being watched for months, possibly longer. Every mundane moment of my life had been captured from angles that defied physics and reason, recorded by equipment that existed in spaces where equipment couldn't possibly be placed. The final clip in the sequence showed my own editing suite, the same room where I sat at that very moment. The footage was shot from somewhere near the ceiling, looking down at my desk with its scattered energy drink cans and tangled cables. I could see myself hunched over my computer, working on the very footage I was watching. But the timestamp on this clip showed it had been recorded 3 hours in the future. I looked up at the ceiling above my workstation, searching for any sign of a camera or recording device. The drop ceiling tiles were undisturbed, the corners free of any obvious surveillance equipment. But according to the footage, in 3 hours I would be sitting in exactly the same position, wearing exactly the same clothes, continuing to work on material that showed me in places I'd never been. The loop was closing. Whatever had recorded me in that abandoned warehouse was here now, in my own space, documenting my discovery of its impossible documentation. The cameras that captured images from angles that couldn't exist were watching me realize they were watching me, creating a recursive spiral of observation that made my vision blur and my breathing shallow. I tried to leave the room, but my legs felt weak and unsteady. The hallway outside my editing suite seemed longer than it should be, stretching away from me like a funhouse mirror distortion. The walls were covered with security cameras I'd never noticed before, each one tracking my movement with mechanical precision. When I finally made it to the building's exit, I found the door locked from the inside. The key I'd been using for months no longer fit the lock, as if the mechanism had been changed while I wasn't paying attention. Through the glass doors, I could see the street beyond, but it looked wrong somehow, the proportions subtly off, the lighting coming from directions that didn't match the position of the streetlights. I returned to my editing suite because there was nowhere else to go. The footage was still playing on my monitor, showing the same impossible perspectives of my own life from angles that shouldn't exist. But now there were new files in the directory, ones that hadn't been there before. Files with timestamps that extended into the next several days, showing footage that hadn't happened yet, but would, because I'd seen it happening, and therefore, it had to happen. I understood then that I wasn't just watching the footage, I was part of it, had always been part of it. The abandoned warehouse, the impossible cameras, the documentation of my daily routine, all of it was part of a larger recording project that included my discovery of the recording project itself. Somewhere in the distance between reality and documentation, I'd become both the observer and the observed, the editor and the edited, the filmmaker, and the subject of a film that was still being made by cameras that existed in the spaces between what was possible and what was necessary. The footage continued to play, showing me sitting in my editing suite, watching footage of myself sitting in my editing suite, watching footage of myself in an endless regression of observation that stretched back to the abandoned warehouse and forward into a future where I would continue watching, continue editing, continue being recorded from angles that couldn't exist by equipment that was always there, but never visible. I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but stopped when I realized that whoever I called would become part of the footage too. The cameras would find them, document them, create impossible perspectives of their lives that would draw them into the same recursive loop that had captured me. Instead, I returned to my work. Because that's what the footage showed me doing. Because in 3 hours, a camera positioned somewhere that couldn't exist would record me in exactly this position, making the discovery that I'd already made, and would continue making for as long as the documentation required. The editing suite hummed with mechanical persistence, its fans whirring against the accumulated heat of computers that had been running far longer than I could remember. The timestamp in the corner of my monitor continued its steady progression toward a future that had already been recorded, would be recorded, was being recorded from an angle that made no sense, but captured everything with perfect, impossible clarity. And in the distance, in the spaces between frames, the cameras continued their patient observation of a reality that existed only because it was being documented by equipment that was always there, always watching, always recording from angles that shouldn't exist but did. because someone had to be watching for any of this to be real at all. Story 12. The fog rolled in like a living thing, thick fingers of gray mist wrapping around my fishing boat until I couldn't see my own hands gripping the wheel. That should have been my first warning to turn back. But the fish had been biting all morning, and I'd already filled 2 coolers. Greed kept me out there longer than sense would have allowed. When the mist finally began to thin, I found myself staring at something that shouldn't have existed. The vessel materialized from the fog like a photograph developing in slow motion. Massive and ancient, its dark hull stretched impossibly long across the water. Wooden planks blackened by decades of salt and weather. 3 towering masts pierced the gray sky, their rigging hanging in tatters that fluttered without any wind. But what froze my blood wasn't the ship's ghostly appearance. It was the bells. 7 bronze bells hung from the main mast, each one different in size and shape, suspended on thick ropes that swayed gently despite the still air. They caught what little light filtered through the clouds, gleaming with an oily sheen that made my stomach turn. Something about those bells felt wrong, fundamentally wrong, as if they violated some natural law I couldn't quite understand. I cut my engine and let my small boat drift closer, drawn by a curiosity that overrode every instinct screaming at me to flee. The phantom vessel sat motionless on the water, not even bobbing with the gentle swells. No crew walked its decks. No sounds came from within its hull. Yet somehow, I knew it was waiting for me. My hands trembled as I tied my boat to a rope ladder hanging from the phantom's side. The moment my feet touched its deck, the temperature plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the railings despite the summer heat I'd left behind on my own boat. The wood beneath my boots felt solid enough, but each step produced a hollow echo that seemed to travel much deeper than the deck's thickness should have allowed. The ship's surface told a story of impossible age. Barnacles clustered thick as tumors along the railings, some still alive and opening and closing with wet, clicking sounds. Salt crystals covered everything in a white patina that glittered like broken glass. When I ran my finger along the main mast, it came away sticky with some dark substance that smelled of rotting seaweed and death. But the bells remained silent. I circled the main mast, studying them more closely. Each bell bore intricate engravings, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. The largest hung at the center, easily 3 feet tall, its bronze surface so dark it appeared almost black. Smaller bells flanked it on either side, descending in size until the smallest was no bigger than my fist. All 7 swayed in perfect unison, as if moved by currents from another world. The silence stretched on, broken only by my ragged breathing and the distant sound of water lapping against the hull. I began to relax, convincing myself this was simply an abandoned vessel, perhaps a reproduction of some historical ship that had broken free from its moorings. The rational explanation calmed my nerves enough that I decided to explore below deck. The moment I descended into the ship's belly, the first bell rang. The sound came from above, a deep bronze note that seemed to resonate through my bones. But as the tone faded, I heard something impossible. The echo came from beneath the ship, muffled and distorted as if the bell were tolling underwater. My pulse quickened as I realized the echo wasn't just coming from below the ship, but from far below, from depths that should have been ocean floor. I scrambled back topside, my heart hammering against my ribs. The bells hung motionless again, showing no sign they had moved. But the sea around the phantom vessel had changed. What had been calm water now showed small swells, waves that hadn't existed moments before. They lapped against the hull with a rhythmic sound that almost resembled whispered words. Almost. The second bell rang 15 minutes later, one of the smaller ones this time. Again, the underwater echo followed, and again the sea grew more agitated. The waves struck the hull harder now, and in their rushing sound, I began to hear something that made my skin crawl. It sounded like voices, distant and unintelligible, but voices nonetheless. I pressed my ear to the deck, trying to locate the source, but the whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. By the third bell, I could no longer deny what I was hearing. Blackwood, the waves whispered against the hull. Blackwood, Blackwood, my surname, spoken by the sea itself. My hands shook as I gripped the railing, knuckles white with strain. Sweat poured down my face despite the unnatural cold, and my mouth felt packed with cotton. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible, that water couldn't speak, that bells couldn't ring from underwater, but the evidence surrounded me, growing stronger with each chiming note. The fourth bell tolled, and the sea's voice grew clearer. Come down, Blackwood. Come down to us. The waves now crashed against the hull with violent force, sending spray high into the air. Each impact carried my name, spoken in dozens of different voices, men, women, children, all calling to me from beneath the phantom vessel. The ship itself began to rock with the growing storm, yet the bells continued their impossible performance, ringing from above while their echoes called from the depths. I stumbled toward my boat, desperate to escape, but found the rope ladder had vanished. Where my small vessel should have been moored, only empty ocean stretched to the horizon. The fog had lifted completely, revealing nothing but open water in every direction. I was trapped aboard this nightmare, with no way to reach safety. The fifth bell rang, larger than the previous four, and the underwater chorus grew deafening. Join us, Blackwood. Join us below. The phantom vessel lurched suddenly, tilting at an impossible angle. I lost my footing and slid across the deck, catching myself against the main mast just as the sixth bell began to toll. The bronze was ice cold against my palms, so cold it burned, but I couldn't let go. The ship was sinking, yet somehow I could still breathe, still see, still hear the terrible symphony building beneath us. Water began rushing across the deck, but it moved wrong, flowing upward from the ocean instead of down from above. The liquid was dark and thick, carrying with it the smell of deep places where sunlight never penetrated. Within its murky depths, I saw shapes moving, pale hands reaching up toward me, faces with empty eye sockets and mouths that moved in silent screams. The seventh and largest bell began to ring, its tone so deep and resonant that it seemed to come from the Earth's core. As its voice joined the underwater symphony, the phantom vessel completed its descent, carrying me down into the dark waters where impossible things waited. But I did not drown. Instead, I found myself standing on the ocean floor, surrounded by the ghostly crew this ship had carried to their watery graves. They stood in perfect formation around the seven bells, which now hung suspended in the water above us, still chiming their eternal song. Each toll sent ripples through the sea, calling more ships to their doom, more sailors to join this underwater procession. The captain stepped forward, his waterlogged uniform hanging in tatters, barnacles growing from his skull where his eyes should have been. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere at once, carried by the current itself. He explained that I had joined their eternal crew, bound to this phantom vessel that sailed between the world of the living and the realm of the drowned. The bells would continue to ring, calling ships into the fog, and I would help lure them to the depths where the crew grew larger with each passing year. But as his words washed over me, I noticed something the captain had missed in his centuries of underwater madness. The bells weren't just calling ships to their doom, they were calling for rescue. Each toll was a cry for help from sailors who had been trapped here, forced to serve against their will. I understood then that the captain wasn't the master of this vessel. He was as much a prisoner as the rest of us, bound by whatever dark force had created this phantom ship. The real power lay in the bells themselves, ancient artifacts that fed on despair and grew stronger with each soul they claimed. The realization gave me the first spark of hope I'd felt since boarding the phantom vessel. If the bells were the source of our imprisonment, then perhaps they could also be the key to our freedom. I began to study them more carefully, noting the symbols carved into their bronze surfaces, the way they moved in the underwater currents, the pattern of their tolling. Months passed, or perhaps years. Time moved differently in this underwater realm. I learned to read the bells' language, to understand the rhythm of their eternal song. And slowly, carefully, I began to plan my escape. The opportunity came during a particularly violent storm above the surface. The bells rang wildly, their chaos disrupting the careful pattern that held us bound to the ocean floor. In that moment of confusion, I reached for the largest bell and twisted it on its rope, reversing the symbols carved into its surface. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The phantom vessel shot upward through the water like a cork released from a bottle. The ghostly crew scattered in all directions, their forms dissolving as the spell that bound them finally broke. I felt myself being pulled up with incredible force, my lungs burning as I rose through fathoms of dark water toward the distant light above. I broke the surface, gasping and choking, my own fishing boat bobbing peacefully nearby as if nothing had happened. The phantom vessel was gone, along with its crew and its terrible bells. Only the normal sounds of ocean waves filled the air, carrying no whispered names or impossible invitations to the depths. But sometimes, on particularly foggy days when I'm out on the water, I can still hear them calling. The bells ring from somewhere far below, their bronze voices carrying across the waves, seeking new sailors to join their eternal crew. And though I escaped their trap, I know that somewhere in the deep places of the ocean, that phantom vessel continues its voyage, waiting for the next fool brave enough to answer its call. I never fish alone anymore, and I always turn back at the first sign of fog, because I know that the bells are still down there, still ringing, still calling my name through the endless dark of the sea. And sometimes, God help me, I'm tempted to answer. Story 13. The festival sprawled before me like a fever dream, its neon lights bleeding into the humid night air like wounds in the darkness. Something was wrong, had been wrong since I'd arrived 3 hours ago. The laughter sounded too sharp, the music too discordant, and the faces in the crowd seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I stood at the edge of the main thoroughfare, my shirt already clinging to my back with cold sweat despite the warm evening. The bass from nearby stages thumped against my ribcage like a second heartbeat, irregular and unsettling. That's when I saw them. 5 figures in dark hooded robes moved through the crowd with purpose, their faces hidden in shadow so deep it seemed to swallow light. They walked in perfect synchronization, parting the festival goers like water around stones. Nobody seemed to notice them, or if they did, their eyes would slide away as if magnetically repelled. My pulse quickened. Every rational thought screamed at me to turn away, to lose myself in the safety of the crowd, but my feet began moving of their own accord. I followed. The hooded figures glided between food trucks and game booths, never pausing, never acknowledging the revelry around them. The farther we moved from the main festival grounds, the dimmer the lights became. String bulbs gave way to flickering torches, then to nothing but the pale wash of distant stage lights filtering through the trees. My breathing grew shallow as we entered what felt like a different world entirely. The sounds of the festival became muffled, as if heard through water. Even the air tasted different here, metallic and stale, like the inside of an old tin can. The grass beneath my sneakers felt spongy and wrong, each step making a soft squelching sound that made my skin crawl. The figures ahead never turned around, yet I had the unshakable feeling they knew I was following. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was certain they could hear it. Sweat beaded on my forehead and upper lip, and I wiped it away with a trembling hand. They stopped before a large canvas tent that squatted in a clearing like a bloated spider. Unlike the colorful carnival structures scattered throughout the festival, this one was a uniform gray that seemed to absorb what little light reached it. No banners announced its purpose. No barkers called out to draw crowds. It simply existed, silent and waiting. The hooded figures filed through the tent's entrance flap without ceremony. I crouched behind a nearby tree, my back pressed against its bark, feeling the rough texture bite into my spine through my shirt. My mouth had gone dry as sand, and when I tried to swallow, nothing happened. The darkness seemed to press in around me, thick and suffocating. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time felt elastic here, unreliable. No one else approached the tent. No sounds emerged from within. I should have left. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run back to the safety of crowds and bright lights. Instead, I found myself creeping toward the tent entrance. The flap hung open like a mouth. I pressed my ear to the canvas near the opening, straining to hear anything from inside. At first, there was only silence so complete it made my ears ring. Then, barely audible, came the soft whisper of drumsticks against drumheads, a rhythm so faint it might have been my imagination. I pulled the flap aside just enough to peer through. The interior defied all logic. The tent was far larger inside than its exterior dimensions could possibly allow. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, lost in shadows that seemed to move and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. Rows upon rows of folding chairs faced a raised platform in the center, each seat occupied by a figure sitting perfectly still. But there was something wrong with the audience. I blinked hard, squeezing my eyes shut and opening them again, certain my vision was playing tricks. The figures in the seats were translucent, like projections or mirages. I could see the backs of chairs through their bodies. Some flickered in and out of visibility like badly tuned television signals. Others were merely outlines sketched in pale light against the darkness. My knees nearly buckled. A cold sweat broke out across my entire body, and I had to grip the tent flap to keep from falling. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Holographs, special effects, some kind of elaborate art installation. But deep in my gut, in that primitive part of the brain that predates rational thought, I knew I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. On the platform, a full drum kit sat bathed in a circle of weak light. The drums were playing themselves. Sticks rose and fell with no hands to guide them, striking heads and cymbals in a complex rhythm that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly through my bones. The ghost audience swayed in unison, their semi-transparent hands coming together in silent applause that produced no sound. I must have made some noise, a gasp, a whimper, because every translucent head in the tent turned toward me. Their faces were holes in the world, not blank or featureless, but actual voids where features should have been. Dark spaces that hurt to look at. The drumming stopped. The sudden silence was worse than any scream could have been. I stumbled backward, my legs tangling beneath me. The tent flap fell closed, but I could feel those hollow gazes boring through the canvas, pinning me like a butterfly to a board. My heart felt like it might explode. Each breath came in sharp, painful gasps that didn't seem to deliver any oxygen to my lungs. I scrambled to my feet and ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the trees, tearing skin and drawing blood I couldn't feel through my panic. Behind me, I heard nothing. No pursuit, no calls, no sounds at all. The silence itself was hunting me. I burst from the tree line back into the festival proper, colliding with a group of teenagers who cursed at me as I stumbled past. The normal sounds of the carnival, music, laughter, the ding of game machines, washed over me like a lifeline. I bent double, hands on my knees, trying to force air into my constricted chest. When I finally looked up, gasping and shaking, I saw him. One of the hooded figures stood at a funnel cake stand 20 feet away, his cowl thrown back to reveal an ordinary face, middle-aged, bearded, completely normal. He was buying dessert with crumpled dollar bills, chatting casually with the vendor about the weather. Just a regular festival goer. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I watched, paralyzed, as the man accepted his purchase and turned in my direction. Our eyes met across the crowd. He smiled, a perfectly pleasant, unremarkable smile, and took a bite of funnel cake. Powdered sugar dusted his beard. Then he winked. The gesture hit me like a physical blow. My vision grayed at the edges, and I thought I might faint. The man turned and melted back into the crowd as if he'd never been there at all. I spent the rest of the night in my car in the parking lot. Doors locked, engine running, heater blasting despite the warm weather. Every shadow looked like a hooded figure. Every distant sound might have been invisible drumsticks against phantom drums. I couldn't stop my hands from shaking long enough to get the key in the ignition for nearly an hour. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I drove home in a daze. I told myself it had been a hallucination, a stress-induced breakdown, too much alcohol and not enough sleep. But deep down, I knew better. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't slept properly since. Every night, just as I'm drifting off, I hear it. The soft whisper of drumsticks against drumheads, barely audible, but unmistakably there. I live in the apartment complex miles from the festival grounds, but somehow the sound finds me. Yesterday, I found a folding chair in my bedroom. I'd never seen it before. It wasn't mine. The landlord swore he hadn't been in my apartment. There was no sign of forced entry, no missing items, nothing else out of place. Just a simple metal folding chair positioned at the foot of my bed, facing toward where I sleep. I threw it in a dumpster behind my building. When I came home from work, it was back. The chair sits there now as I write this, and I can't bring myself to look at it directly. In my peripheral vision, I swear I can sometimes see a faint outline sitting in it, translucent, flickering, patient, waiting for a show that may have already begun. I've started hearing applause in the walls. The logical part of my mind insists this is all psychological. Trauma manifesting as paranoid delusions, perfectly explainable and treatable. But every instinct I possess whispers a different truth. I was never meant to see what I saw in that tent. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Some audiences aren't meant to be joined. The drumming is getting louder now, and I can feel eyes that aren't there watching me from a chair that shouldn't exist. The festival ended weeks ago, but I'm beginning to understand that for some of us, the show never really stops. It just changes venues. Story 14. The silence in the Ozark Mountains had teeth. I discovered this truth on my third night camping alone, when the absence of sound became so complete, it pressed against my eardrums like water at depth. No cricket chirps, no owl calls, no rustling leaves despite the wind that rocked my RV with enough force to make the aluminum siding creak. The forest held its breath, and something deep in my gut warned me to hold mine too. I'd come to these mountains to escape the noise. The endless chatter of co-workers, the drone of traffic, the constant buzz of notifications that had driven me to the edge of a breakdown 3 months prior. Dr. Martinez had suggested a digital detox, somewhere remote where I could reconnect with myself. The irony wasn't lost on me now, sitting in this suffocating quiet, that I'd found exactly what I'd been running from. The sound of my own thoughts, amplified by solitude until they echoed off the limestone bluffs like accusations. The first voice came at 2:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I'd been staring at my phone's clock, one of the few devices I'd kept active for emergencies. The blue glow hurt my eyes in the darkness of the RV's cramped interior. But sleep had abandoned me hours ago. My heart had been racing since sunset, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Some primal part of my brain kept insisting danger lurked outside, despite the locked doors and drawn curtains. Marcus. The whisper drifted through the thin walls like smoke through cloth. My name, spoken so softly I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. But the hairs on my forearms stood at attention, and my mouth went dry as sawdust. I sat motionless on the narrow bed, straining to hear more. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing down on the RV like a physical weight. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Wind through the trees, a dream bleeding into consciousness, my own subconscious playing tricks after 3 days of isolation. But when I tried to swallow, my throat clicked audibly in the stillness, and I realized my hands were trembling. Minutes crawled by. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, so loud I worried it might draw whatever had spoken my name back to investigate. When no other sounds came, I forced myself to lie down, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin like a child hiding from monsters. The aluminum shell of the RV suddenly felt pathetically inadequate. A tin can in an ocean of trees and stone. I didn't sleep. Dawn brought no relief. If anything, the morning light revealed how isolated I truly was. My campsite sat in a natural depression surrounded by towering limestone formations, their surfaces carved into impossible shapes by millennia of wind and rain. The narrow dirt road I'd followed to reach this spot had seemed clear enough yesterday, but now thick branches hung across it like a curtain drawn shut. I couldn't remember them being so low, so dense. The RV's engine coughed when I turned the key. Once, twice. On the third try, it caught with a reluctant rumble that echoed off the stone walls around me. I needed supplies. My food was running low, and more importantly, I needed to see other people, to remind myself that the world beyond these mountains still existed. But as I shifted into drive, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. The starter clicked uselessly, a sound like bones snapping in the silence. My hands were slick with sweat as I turned the key again and again, desperation mounting with each failed attempt. The battery showed full charge. The fuel gauge read 3/4 full. Everything appeared normal, yet the engine refused to turn over. That's when I heard the second voice. He wants to leave. This time the whisper seemed to come from the limestone cliff face to my left. I spun in the driver's seat, searching for the source, but saw only weathered stone and the dark mouths of shallow caves. My pulse hammered in my throat, and I could taste copper on my tongue. The voice had been different from the first, feminine, with an accent I couldn't place. Old, ancient even. A third voice joined in, seeming to emanate from the rocks on my right. He dreams of Sarah in room 237, dreams of her mouth on his. I slammed my hands over my ears, but the whisper continued, describing intimate fantasies I'd never shared with anyone. Private thoughts that lived only in the deepest recesses of my mind, shameful desires I'd buried so deep I barely acknowledged them myself. The voice knew details that should have been impossible. The way Sarah from accounting tucked her hair behind her left ear when nervous. The scar on her collarbone I'd glimpsed once when she'd leaned over my desk. "Stop," I said aloud, my voice cracking. "Just stop." But they didn't stop. More voices joined in, a whispered chorus rising from the stone formations that surrounded me like amphitheater walls. They spoke my name in different tongues, in accents spanning centuries. They recited my browser history, my late-night searches for meaning and connection. They described the pills I'd considered taking 3 months ago when the darkness felt too heavy to bear. They knew about the loaded gun I'd held for 17 minutes one Tuesday evening before putting it back in the safe. Each whisper made the engine fail more completely. The electrical system flickered and died. The air conditioning wheezed to a stop. Even my phone's battery drained as the voices grew stronger, the screen going black despite showing 60% charge moments before. I stumbled out of the RV, gasping for air that felt thick as mud. The morning sun blazed overhead, but cold sweat covered my body in a clammy sheen. My legs shook as I approached the nearest limestone formation, desperate to understand what was happening to me. The stone was warm to the touch, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my terrified heartbeat. Fissures ran through the rock like veins, and when I pressed my ear against the surface, I could hear movement inside. Not the scurrying of insects or small animals, but something larger. Something that shifted and breathed in the hollow spaces between limestone layers. Marcus knows we're here now. The voice came from directly beneath my cheek, vibrating through the stone and into my skull. I jerked back, stumbling over loose rocks, and fell hard on my tailbone. The impact sent shockwaves of pain up my spine, but I barely felt it over the terror that consumed every nerve ending. Around me, the whispers grew to a murmur, then to a conversation. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, discussing me like I was an interesting specimen they'd discovered. They debated my fears, my regrets, my most carefully guarded secrets. One voice mentioned the affair I'd had 5 years ago, the one that ended my marriage, the one I'd never admitted to anyone, not even my therapist. Another described the morning I'd found my father's body and waited 4 hours before calling 911, paralyzed by relief that his suffering was finally over. I covered my ears again, but the voices came from inside my head now. They'd found a way in through the stone, through the vibrations that traveled from rock to flesh to bone. My skull felt like a radio receiver tuned to a station that broadcast only shame and terror. The forest around me had changed. The trees stood closer together, their branches intertwined so thickly that sunlight could barely penetrate. The dirt road that had brought me here was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of thorns and twisted oak. I was trapped in a natural prison, and my captors were the mountains themselves. I ran back to the RV, fumbling with my emergency radio. Static filled the speaker, but underneath the white noise, I could hear them. The voices, transmitted through radio waves, describing the time I'd stolen money from my grandmother's purse to buy drugs. They knew about the dog I'd hit with my car and driven away from, telling myself it was probably fine. They knew about every cruel word I'd ever spoken, every kind act I'd failed to perform, every moment of weakness that had shaped the man I'd become. The radio dissolved into pure static, then died completely. For hours, I paced inside the RV like a caged animal. The voices continued their whispered inventory of my failures, growing more detailed and personal with each revelation. They described the taste of my fear. Apparently it reminded them of copper pennies and burnt coffee. They discussed my scent, noting how desperation had a particular sweetness that they found appealing. As afternoon wore into evening, I realized they weren't just observing me. They were feeding. Each whisper seemed to drain something from me. Color from my vision, warmth from my body, hope from my heart. I caught my reflection in the RV's small mirror and barely recognized the gaunt, hollow-eyed man staring back. My skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and my lips were cracked and colorless. The voices were consuming me from the inside out, turning my own memories and secrets into sustenance. Night fell like a lead curtain, and with darkness came a new development. The whispers stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own breathing. Shallow, panicked gasps that misted in air that had grown unnaturally cold. Frost began forming on the RV's windows despite the September heat. My breath clouded as I exhaled, and I could see my pulse beating visibly in my throat. Then the laughter started. It bubbled up from the limestone formations like water from a spring, rich and warm and utterly inhuman. The sound made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I pressed my face against the RV's rear window and saw shapes moving in the stone. Dark figures that flowed through solid rock like dolphins through water. They were coming closer, drawn by the feast they'd been preparing all day. I tried the engine one more time. It started immediately, purring like a contented cat. The headlights blazed to life, and I could see the road again, clear and inviting, stretching away from this cursed place toward civilization and sanity. But as I shifted into drive, one final voice spoke. This one came from inside the RV, so close I could feel breath on my neck. "We'll be waiting when you come back, Marcus. We know you will. We know everything you want, everything you fear, everything you are, and we're still hungry." I floored the accelerator, tires spinning on loose gravel as I fled down the mountain road. In my rearview mirror, I watched the limestone formations fade into darkness, but the laughter followed me for miles, echoing off canyon walls long after I should have been out of range. I didn't stop driving until I reached Little Rock, 12 hours later. I sold the RV that same morning and flew home to Chicago, telling myself I'd never return to Arkansas. But they were right, of course. They knew me better than I knew myself. Because 3 weeks later, as I sat in my apartment scrolling through camping websites, I found myself searching for campsites in the Ozark Mountains. My finger hovered over the booking button for that same isolated spot, and for just a moment, I could swear I heard whispers coming from my laptop speakers, faint voices calling my name, promising they had so much more to show me. I closed the laptop and went to bed, but the dreams that came were filled with limestone caves and ancient voices that knew every secret I'd ever kept. And when I woke up the next morning, there was a confirmation email in my inbox for a campsite reservation I didn't remember making. The date was for next weekend. I stared at the screen for a long time, my heart racing with the same terror I'd felt in those mountains. But underneath the fear was something else, a twisted anticipation, a hunger that matched their own. They had taken something from me during those 3 days, but they'd also given me something in return. The knowledge that I wasn't alone with my secrets anymore. Someone was always listening, Someone always knew. And as much as the thought terrified me, it also brought a dark comfort I'd never experienced before. I left the reservation active and started packing my bags. Story 15. The metallic screech of brakes against steel rails pierced through the fog of my alcohol-hazed mind like a rusty knife dragging across concrete. Something was wrong. Terribly, fundamentally wrong. I pressed my face against the cold window of the train car, my breath fogging the glass as I tried to peer into the suffocating darkness beyond. The party had ended hours ago, but the taste of cheap wine still clung to my tongue like a metallic residue that wouldn't wash away. My head throbbed with each heartbeat, a steady drumming that seemed to echo the rhythmic clacking of the train wheels that had now fallen ominously silent. The train had stopped. My stomach lurched as I realized we weren't at a station. The familiar fluorescent lights of a platform were nowhere to be seen. Instead, we sat motionless in what appeared to be an abandoned tunnel, its walls barely visible through the grimy window. The darkness pressed against the glass like a living thing, dense and impenetrable, as if the very concept of light had been surgically removed from this place. I glanced around the car, expecting to see other passengers sharing my confusion, but the realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I was completely alone. The worn fabric seats stretched endlessly in both directions, empty and somehow accusatory in their silence. How had I not noticed this before? My heart began to hammer against my ribcage, each beat sending sharp pulses of adrenaline through my already trembling hands. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, then settled into an unstable rhythm that cast moving shadows across the interior. In that stuttering illumination, I noticed something that made my mouth go dry with terror. Floating outside the window, suspended in the blackness of the tunnel, were dozens of clocks, not hanging from chains or mounted on walls, but simply floating in the air like jellyfish drifting through dark water. Each clock was different. Ornate grandfather clocks, simple wall clocks, pocket watches, digital displays. But they all shared one impossible characteristic. None of them had hands or numbers. Their faces were blank, empty circles staring back at me like hollow eyes. They rotated slowly in the darkness, their surfaces catching and reflecting the train's flickering lights in ways that shouldn't have been possible. My breathing became shallow and rapid. The air in the car felt thick, almost viscous, as if I were trying to breathe through cotton. Sweat began to bead on my forehead despite the chill that seemed to emanate from the windows. I rubbed my eyes hard, hoping this was some alcohol-induced hallucination, but when I opened them again, the clocks were still there, still spinning their silent dance in the void. A soft hiss filled the car as the doors at the far end slid open. Two figures entered, moving with an unnatural gliding motion that made no sound against the metal floor. My spine turned to ice as I watched them approach. They wore what appeared to be the dark uniforms of train conductors, complete with brass buttons that gleamed despite the poor lighting. But where their faces should have been, there was nothing. Not darkness, not shadow, but an absence so complete it seemed to pull at my vision, making my eyes water as they struggled to focus on something that simply wasn't there. The figures stopped beside my seat, and I could feel their non-presence turning toward me. One of them reached into his jacket with movements that seemed to exist outside of normal time, too smooth, too fluid, like watching a film played at the wrong speed. From some impossible pocket, he produced a ticket. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and covered in script that seemed to shift and writhe when I tried to read it. The conductor without a face extended the ticket toward me. Though no words were spoken aloud, I could hear his voice inside my skull, reverberating through my bones with the weight of grinding stone. He told me this was a special ticket, one that would allow me to return to any moment in my past. All I had to do was accept it, and put on the mask they would provide. The second figure produced a mask from somewhere within his uniform. It was ancient-looking, carved from what might have been bone or some other organic material that had yellowed with age. The surface was smooth but somehow wrong, as if it had been worn by countless faces before mine. Deep gouges that might have been eye holes stared up at me from the mask's surface, and I had the unsettling certainty that something was looking back at me from within those dark recesses. My hands shook as I stared at the offered items. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, cataloging all the ways this situation defied logic and reality. But another part of me, a deeper part that had been shaped by years of regret and missed opportunities, whispered seductively about the possibilities. Every mistake I'd ever made, every word I'd left unspoken, every chance I'd let slip away, all of it could be undone. The air around the faceless conductors seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly energy. I could smell something metallic and sharp, like the scent of copper pennies mixed with ozone before a thunderstorm. The temperature in the car dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath forming small clouds that dissipated far too quickly in the still air. Outside the windows, the floating clocks had begun to move faster, spinning and tumbling through the darkness in increasingly frantic patterns. Their blank faces seemed to pulse with an inner light that had no source, casting strange shadows that moved independently of their rotating forms. The sight made my stomach churn with vertigo, as if I were falling through space while sitting perfectly still. I reached out toward the ticket with trembling fingers, then stopped. Something about the way the paper seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it made my skin crawl. The surface looked soft, almost flesh-like, and I had the horrible suspicion that if I touched it, it would be warm. The mask in the second conductor's hand seemed to grow heavier, more substantial, as if it were becoming more real simply by my considering it. The voice in my head grew more insistent, painting vivid pictures of all the moments I could return to. I saw myself taking the job I'd turned down, speaking to the woman I'd never had the courage to approach, preventing the argument that had destroyed my relationship with my brother. The images were so clear, so perfectly detailed, that they felt more real than my current surroundings. But with each vision came a sense of wrongness that I couldn't quite define. The scenes were perfect, yes, but they felt hollow, like beautiful shells with nothing inside. The people in these imagined scenarios moved with the same unnatural fluidity as the conductors before me, their faces slightly out of focus as if viewed through dirty glass. I pulled my hand back, clenching my fist to stop the trembling. The effort sent sharp pains up my arms, and I realized I had been holding my breath for far longer than should have been possible. When I finally exhaled, the sound was ragged and harsh in the unnatural quiet of the car. The conductors didn't move, or react to my hesitation, but the atmosphere around them seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. The floating clocks outside had begun to emit a low humming sound that I felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to resonate in my bones and make my teeth ache. The blank faces of the timepieces had started to glow more brightly, casting shifting patterns of light across the tunnel walls that hurt to look at directly. I forced myself to study the mask more carefully, and what I saw made my blood turn to slush in my veins. The surface wasn't smooth after all. It was covered in tiny, intricate carvings that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Faces, I realized with growing horror. Hundreds of tiny faces carved into the bone-like material, all screaming silently, their mouths open in expressions of eternal anguish. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Those faces belonged to everyone who had worn the mask before me. Every person who had accepted this offer, who had tried to return to their past, was somehow trapped within that ancient artifact. They had traded their present for a chance to change their history, only to become prisoners of time itself. The ticket in the first conductor's hand began to smoke slightly at the edges, the yellowed paper curling as if exposed to invisible flame. The script on its surface writhed more violently, the words rearranging themselves into patterns that made my eyes water and my head spin with vertigo. I caught glimpses of text that seemed to be written in languages that predated human speech, symbols that conveyed meaning directly to my brain without passing through normal comprehension. My breathing became increasingly labored as the air in the car continued to thicken. Each inhalation felt like trying to breathe through wet cloth, and a metallic taste began to coat my tongue. The sweat on my forehead had turned cold and clammy, running down my face in rivulets that stung my eyes. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, a rapid drumbeat that seemed to synchronize with the humming of the clocks outside. The conductors began to lean closer, their absent faces somehow conveying impatience despite having no features to express emotion. The air around them rippled like heat waves rising from hot asphalt, distorting my vision and making the already surreal scene even more nightmarish. I could feel their attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, as if invisible eyes were examining every inch of my body and finding it wanting. I forced myself to stand on unsteady legs, my knees threatening to buckle under the weight of the supernatural pressure that filled the car. The movement sent waves of dizziness crashing through my skull, and for a moment the world tilted sideways, the floor seeming to become a wall before snapping back to its proper orientation. With tremendous effort, I managed to speak, my voice coming out as a hoarse whisper that seemed to be absorbed by the oppressive atmosphere before it could travel more than a few inches. I told them I didn't want their offer, that I wouldn't take the ticket or wear the mask. The words felt thick and foreign in my mouth, as if I were speaking a language I had never learned. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The humming from the clocks outside rose to a pitch that made my bones vibrate painfully, and the lights in the car began to strobe with increasing violence. The conductor's form seemed to waver and expand, becoming larger and more imposing despite their continued lack of faces. The ticket in the first one's hand burst into flames that burned without heat, the paper curling into ash that floated upward in defiance of gravity. But even as the supernatural forces around me raged with apparent fury, I felt something else. A loosening of the oppressive atmosphere, as if my refusal had somehow broken a fundamental rule that governed this place. The air began to clear slightly, becoming marginally easier to breathe, and the crushing weight on my chest lightened just enough to allow me to take a full breath. The train lurched suddenly, throwing me back into my seat with bruising force. The familiar sound of wheels on rails resumed, but now the rhythm seemed urgent, almost frantic. Through the windows, I watched the floating clocks begin to fade, their impossible light dimming until they were nothing more than vague shadows in the darkness. The conductors stood frozen for a moment longer, then began to dissolve like smoke, their forms becoming increasingly transparent until they vanished entirely. As the train picked up speed, racing through the tunnel toward some unknown destination, I slumped in my seat, my entire body shaking with exhaustion and residual terror. My clothes were soaked with sweat, and my hands trembled so violently I had to clench them together to make them stop. The metallic taste in my mouth had intensified, and I could feel my pulse gradually slowing from its frantic pace. The lights in the car stabilized, returning to their normal steady glow, and the oppressive atmosphere that had surrounded the conductors dissipated like morning fog. But even as the immediate supernatural threat faded, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than death. The memory of those tiny screaming faces carved into the mask's surface would haunt me for the rest of my life. The train began to slow, and ahead I could see the welcome glow of a real station platform. As we pulled to a stop, the doors hissed open normally, and I stumbled out onto the concrete, my legs barely able to support my weight. The station was empty except for a single security guard who looked at me with mild concern, probably attributing my disheveled appearance to too much alcohol rather than a brush with forces beyond human understanding. I made my way home through the pre-dawn streets, my mind struggling to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as an elaborate hallucination brought on by exhaustion and alcohol, but the lingering taste of metal in my mouth and the deep ache in my bones suggested otherwise. Whatever had occurred in that tunnel had been real, terrifyingly real. In the days that followed, I found myself checking train schedules obsessively, making sure I never again found myself on the last train of the night. But more than that, I began to appreciate my present in ways I never had before. Every mistake, every missed opportunity, every regret that had once seemed unbearable, now felt precious, simply because it was mine, because it belonged to a life I was actually living, rather than trapped within some supernatural prison. The mask, with its cargo of eternally screaming faces, had shown me the true horror of trying to escape from time itself. Some things I learned were far worse than living with regret. Story 16. The house came to me through death, as inheritances often do, carrying with it the musty scent of forgotten years and the weight of a solitude so profound it seemed to seep through the very walls. Uncle Morris had been a stranger to me in life, a reclusive figure mentioned only in hushed family conversations, and now his isolated property sprawled before me like an accusation I couldn't quite understand. The first thing I noticed about the place wasn't the peeling paint or the sagging porch boards, but the silence. It pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical weight, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant whisper of wind through overgrown trees. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and cell service died somewhere around mile marker 7 on the winding dirt road that led to this forgotten corner of the world. I'd planned to spend just a few days sorting through Morris's belongings before putting the place on the market, but by the third afternoon, as I wandered the property's overgrown perimeter, I discovered something that made my plans suddenly feel less certain. Hidden behind a tangle of brambles and young saplings, almost invisible beneath years of accumulated debris, stood an old stone well. The structure itself seemed ancient, its rough-hewn stones dark with age and moisture. Someone had covered it with weathered planks, nailed down with rusty spikes that had clearly been there for decades. The wood had warped and split with time, creating narrow gaps that revealed nothing but impenetrable darkness below. A cold draft rose from those gaps, carrying with it a smell that reminded me of wet earth and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. My hands trembled slightly as I cleared away the debris, though I told myself it was just the autumn chill. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the well like grasping fingers. I found myself stepping back from the covered opening, my heart rate inexplicably quickening. The rational part of my mind noted that old wells could be dangerous, unstable structures, bad air, potential cave-ins. But there was something else, something primal, that whispered warnings I couldn't quite articulate. That first night, alone in Morris's creaking house, I tried to dismiss the well from my thoughts. I'd covered it back up, told myself I'd deal with it properly in the morning, maybe call someone to fill it in safely. But as I lay in the narrow bed in what had been Morris's room, listening to the house settle around me, I became aware of another sound threading through the darkness. It started as barely more than a whisper, so faint I almost convinced myself it was wind through the eaves or mice in the walls. But as I strained to listen, my breath held and my body rigid beneath the thin blankets, the sound resolved into something that made my blood turn to ice. It was a voice, muffled and distant, calling up from somewhere deep below the earth, and it was calling my name. The voice was my own. I sat up so fast that black spots danced across my vision, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Sweat broke out across my forehead despite the cold air seeping through the old windows. I told myself I was imagining things, that isolation and the stress of dealing with a dead relative's affairs were playing tricks on my mind. But even as I tried to rationalize it away, the sound continued. My voice, pleading and desperate, drifting up from the direction of the well. "Please," it whispered in my own inflection, with my own accent, carrying the exact cadence I'd inherited from my father's side of the family. "Please help me. I'm so cold down here." My throat felt like I'd swallowed sand. I stumbled to the window that faced the back of the property, pressing my face against the glass until my breath fogged the surface. The well was invisible in the darkness, but I could feel it out there, a presence that seemed to pulse with malevolent attention. The voice continued its pleading, sometimes louder, sometimes so soft I had to strain to hear it, but always with that terrible familiarity that made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in Morris's old rocking chair, facing the window, watching for any sign of movement in the darkness beyond. My hands shook as I gripped the armrests, and I found myself speaking aloud just to hear the difference between my real voice and the one calling from below. The contrast should have been reassuring, but somehow it only made things worse. The voice from the well was getting clearer, more distinct, as if whatever was making it was learning, improving its mimicry with each passing hour. By dawn, the voice had stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt almost accusatory. I made coffee with trembling hands, the simple task grounding me in the mundane reality of morning light and caffeine. In the bright autumn sunshine streaming through the kitchen windows, the events of the night seemed surreal, like fragments of a nightmare that stubbornly refused to fade. But when I caught sight of myself in the small mirror beside the kitchen sink, something cold and electric shot down my spine. My reflection looked wrong. The change was subtle, so slight that I almost dismissed it as a trick of the morning light or the old mirror's imperfections. But there was something different about the angle of my jaw, the spacing of my eyes. It was still clearly me, but like a photograph that had been slightly distorted, as if someone had taken my face and stretched it just enough to create an uncanny valley effect that made my brain scream warnings I couldn't quite process. I stared at my reflection for long minutes, turning my head from side to side, trying to identify exactly what had changed. My facial features seemed to shift slightly with each movement, never quite settling into the familiar configuration I'd seen in mirrors my entire adult life. The sensation was deeply unsettling, like looking at a stranger wearing my skin. The second night brought the voice back with increased intensity. This time it didn't just call my name. It spoke in full sentences, recounting memories only I should know. It described my childhood dog's favorite hiding spot under the porch stairs, the scar on my knee from a bicycle accident when I was 12, the way my mother used to hum while folding laundry. Each personal detail felt like a violation, as if something was rifling through my private memories and using them against me. "Remember when you broke Mom's vase?" The voice whispered from the depths and my blood turned to slush. I did remember. I'd been 7 years old playing ball in the house despite repeated warnings. The vase had been my grandmother's, and my mother had cried when she found the pieces. I'd never told anyone it was me. "You hid the pieces under your bed for 3 days before you got brave enough to confess." My breath came in short, sharp gasps that fogged the cold air of the bedroom. How could it know that? How could anything know that? The memory was mine alone, buried so deep I rarely thought about it myself. But there it was, being spoken back to me in my own voice from something lurking in the darkness below the earth. Each morning my reflection grew more distorted. The changes were gradual but undeniable. My nose seemed longer, my eyes set deeper in my skull. The symmetry of my face shifted in ways that made me dizzy to contemplate. I began avoiding mirrors, but the old house was full of reflective surfaces, and catching unexpected glimpses of my altered appearance became a constant source of terror. By the fourth day, I couldn't bring myself to go outside. The well exerted a pull I could feel even through the walls of the house, a magnetic attraction that made my legs weak and my hands shake. I knew with a certainty that bypassed rational thought that something was climbing up from the depths. Something that wanted what I had, that was studying me, learning me, preparing to replace me entirely. The voice had evolved beyond mere mimicry. Now it spoke with my exact tone, my precise pronunciation, even capturing the slight hoarseness I developed when nervous. It told stories about my life with perfect accuracy, but with subtle changes that made my skin crawl. It described my job in accounting, but claimed I worked with numbers all day because I loved the way they added up to nothing. It talked about my ex-girlfriend Sarah, but insisted we'd broken up because she'd seen something terrible in my eyes one night. Something that wasn't me at all. Sleep became impossible. I found myself pacing the narrow hallways of Morris's house, jumping at every creak and groan of the settling structure. My reflection continued to change, becoming more pronounced with each passing hour. Now my features looked genuinely alien, as if my face was slowly being reshaped by unseen hands. The effect was subtle enough that a stranger might not notice. But to me, the person who'd lived with this face for 32 years, the transformation was horrifying. On the fifth night, the voice changed tactics. Instead of pleading or recounting memories, it began to speak with confidence, authority. It described what it was going to do once it finished climbing up from the well, how it would take my place in the world above. It knew about my apartment back in the city, my job, my friends. It spoke about them with casual familiarity, as if it had already met them. already fooled them into thinking it was me. "They won't notice the difference," my voice said from the depths, tinged now with something that might have been amusement. "I'm getting very good at being you. Better than you are, actually. I don't have your doubts, your fears. I'll be an improved version." My hands shook so violently I could barely hold a glass of water. The terror wasn't just in what the voice was saying, but in how right it sounded, how confident, how much like the person I wished I could be, certain, unafraid, improved. The sixth morning brought a new horror. When I looked in the bathroom mirror, preparing to shave, the reflection that stared back at me was no longer quite human. My features had elongated and twisted into something that belonged in nightmares. But the worst part wasn't how I looked. It was how natural it felt. The face in the mirror moved with my movements, expressed my emotions. But it was becoming something else entirely. I realized then what was happening. Whatever was in the well wasn't just copying me. It was stealing me, piece by piece, feature by feature. Each night, it climbed a little higher, got a little closer to the surface, and with each upward movement, it pulled more of my true self down into the darkness to replace what it lost in the ascent. That afternoon, I heard footsteps on the porch. My heart stopped completely for several seconds before resuming at a pace that made me dizzy. The footsteps were measured, confident, accompanied by the sound of someone whistling a tune I recognized, a song my father used to whistle while working in the garage. The melody drifted through the walls of the house with perfect pitch and timing, exactly as I might whistle it myself. The front door opened without hesitation, without the squeal of hinges I'd grown accustomed to. Someone entered the house as if they belonged there, their footsteps moving with familiarity through the front hallway. I pressed myself against the wall of the kitchen, my breath coming in silent gasps that made my chest ache. "I'm home," called a voice that was unmistakably mine, but carried none of the fear that had plagued me for days. It was confident, relaxed, happy even. "Sorry I took so long. Had to climb all the way up from the bottom." The footsteps moved through the house with purpose, their owner clearly knowing the layout intimately. I heard the creak of the rocking chair as someone settled into it, heard the satisfied sigh of someone finally comfortable after a long journey. Through the gap beneath the kitchen door, I could see a shadow that moved with familiar gestures, familiar posture. "You can come out now," the voice said, and I could hear the smile in it. "We should talk. There are some things you need to understand about what's going to happen next." But I couldn't move. My legs had turned to water, my entire body locked in a paralysis that went beyond simple fear. Because I recognized the truth now, the horrible logic of what was happening. The thing that had climbed up from the well wasn't just copying me, it was me. Or at least, it was what I was becoming. And if it was here, sitting in Morris's chair and calling this place home, then what did that make me? I looked down at my hands and saw that they were beginning to fade, becoming translucent around the edges. My solid reality was dissolving, being pulled down toward that dark well to fill the space left by whatever had escaped from its depths. Soon, I would be the one calling up from the darkness, pleading for help in a voice that grew more distorted with each passing day, while something improved took my place in the light above. The house was quiet now except for the gentle creaking of the rocking chair and the sound of something, that looked exactly like me getting comfortable in a life that had once been mine. Outside, the well stood open, its rotted wooden cover finally cast aside, revealing a circular opening that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of sleeping lungs. I understood now why Morris had lived alone all those years, why he'd covered the well so carefully, why he'd never spoken about this place to the family. He'd known what lived down there, what it wanted, what it eventually took. And now it was my turn to learn the same lesson he had learned, the same truth that every owner of this property eventually discovered. The thing in the chair began to whistle again, and I realized with a cold certainty that settled in my bones like winter fog that very soon, I would be the one trying to climb back up toward the light, calling out with a voice that grew more desperate and less recognizable each day, while above me, something that wore my face perfectly lived the life I could no longer claim.